Oh, that's adorable. Wow. All right, Adam, are we ready to roll? Okay. Awesome. Well, oh, and Adam, if you don't mind making me a co-host, I can share my screen. So hi everyone, great to see you all. Welcome to the 7th meeting of the Energy Code Board. And we've got a lot of good stuff to cover with you guys today. So I'm gonna go ahead and dive right in. I hope you all had a nice weekend and your Mondays are off to a decent start so far. So our agenda today looks like this. We're going to start with a approval of the meeting minutes after we take a look through the agenda. And then we'll give you guys an update on where we've landed with our new schedule, adding in those 2 additional meetings that we sent you guys a scheduling poll about. We'll then move on to see if you guys want to bring up or discuss any public comments that were received. And then for the rest of the meeting, we'll dive back into our code language. So we'll start by wrapping up our discussion on commercial EV ready codes. We'll take a look at the survey results, see where the board generally landed, and then open it up for discussion. And then we'll move on to residential EV ready codes and discuss sort of the space allocation and any other things that we need to talk about with you guys in order to draft that first, take our first stab at the draft code language. After we discuss EV ready codes, we'll move on to electric ready codes. And our goal is to spend about an hour on EV ready, about an hour on electric ready. We'll see how all of that shakes out. Obviously, the discussion will take itself wherever it needs to go. But we'll start with residential electric ready code and move on to small commercial electric ready code discussion if we have time during today's meeting. And then moving at our next meeting is when we'll dive into the large commercial electric ready code. So before I advance, would love to hear a motion, if there is one, to approve the meeting minutes, or if there are any edits or changes that need to be made, we'd love to hear those now.
This is Kevin. I move to approve the minutes as presented.
I'll second.
Thank you, guys. All in favor?
Aye.
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 And any abstain or not in favor? Okay, meeting minutes are approved. Thank you all. We'll get those posted on the website. So moving along to our scheduling update. So based on the results of the scheduling poll that we sent out, the time that worked best for the majority of board members to add our new meeting in the middle of our meeting series is Wednesday, March 1st from 12 to 3 p.m. So you guys should have received a calendar invite from Adam for this meeting. And then as you guys might recall, we discussed adding a final meeting after our meeting on March 28th, where we'll be hearing public comment to conduct a final vote on all of the code language if any changes happen from public comment. So that final meeting is going to be Friday, March 31st from 12 to 3. It generally seemed like most folks were available that whole day Friday. So we went with a consistent meeting time that we've been usually hitting, which is the 12 to 3 time block. So if you guys have any concerns about either one of these meetings, and I'll kind of show you how these will show up in our schedule and what we'll be doing in these meetings. But if you guys have concerns, please reach out to Adam and I, and we can see what we can do to make sure we're accommodating folks' schedules. So there's a lot going on this slide, but basically I wanted to let you guys know where these new meetings are falling and what we're going to be discussing at each new meeting, so you guys can have a sense of how the rest of our meetings will flow. So today is this first meeting up here. We're going to wrap up EVs and dive into electric ready. Our next meeting is Thursday, February 23rd, so 10 days from now. In here, we'll be discussing large commercial electric ready and our methodology for variance, which we'll explain in greater detail, but as part of our decision making that we must do as a board. I'll come back to this little blue bar. Our next meeting is going to be that newly scheduled March 1st meeting. And so at this meeting, I've got it tagged right now as discussion and vote. We might have some things we need to wrap up from our large commercial electric ready discussion, so we'll do that at that meeting. And this will then be the first meeting where we will start to have a preliminary vote on draft code language. So our goal is going to be to get through solar ready and at least start electric ready code language voting. And then our next two meetings, March 6th and March 20th, will be continuing the preliminary votes on the code language. Moving along to March 28th, we'll have our public engagement meeting where we will have first half of the meeting being public comment, second half of the meeting being board discussion. And then our final meeting on March 31st will be a final vote on all of the code elements. So I just want to flag within this schedule that it is our intent to make sure that we're getting you guys the draft code language package or the draft code language for voting as soon as possible ahead of the meeting, right? We want to give you guys as much time to review the code language and come prepared with your thoughts for these meetings where we're going to be voting. So in order to accomplish that, first we need to have discussed the code elements with you guys. So we will have gotten guidance on how to draft the code language. Then our code language package goes through our technical advisors. They review it all, and then we're going to send it to you guys. So our goal is for the solar ready and EV ready code language to get you that next Monday, February 20th. And that should give you about a week and a half to review before we will start voting on that Wednesday, March 1st. For the residential electric code ready language, since we'll ideally be covering that today, our goal is to get that to you middle of the week, next week. And then we'll have to wait until this Thursday, February 23rd meeting where we discuss the large commercial electric ready in order to draft the code language package and get it to you guys. But we have out until March 20th for that vote. So just a heads up, we will start sending you guys code language next week. We hope that you guys will take the time to review it, flag any things that you're concerned about and want to discuss with the board, and bring those to the meetings where we are planning our vote. So that's a lot of information. Any questions, comments, thoughts on this?
Looks good.
Okay. Thanks, Carolyn. Great. Well, we've got a lot to accomplish in the next couple of next month and a half, but we're going to get there. So now we'll move us along to public comments and code proposals. So I will pause here and see if anyone from the board has anything that they'd like to bring up that was received as a public comment.
Kim, I just wanted to flag the question in the chat that might be worth getting some clarification on.
Thanks, Carolyn. Yeah, Adam, do you want to jump in?
I was just going to turn it over to David to answer that. My understanding to the answer to Tom's question is no, a board member has to be present and there is no opportunity for proxies in order to vote. But David, if you want to comment further on that, please feel free.
That's right. Hi, everyone. That's right. Just from my memory of how we drafted the bylaws, you must be present to win. I can double check that right now just to be sure I'm remembering that right.
Thank you.
Thanks, David. And Chris, did you have a question as well?
Oh, no, just a reflection on public comments. Which was generally, it was interesting to see a number of comments on the EV ready side, encouraging us to consider, more robust percentages for EV ready, particularly in multi-family housing. So I'm sure others noticed that, but it stood out to me that the majority of comments were supportive of EV ready requirements that kind of mesh with the anticipated adoption of electric vehicles over the lifetime of the buildings that are to be constructed.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. Tim.
Yeah, hi, thanks, Tim Pate. I found interesting some of the comments, public comments concerning the concern, I guess you might put it, of the grid being able to handle the additional requirements for what we're proposing to do. And I know we're not talking about electrification, at least with this legislation, but I know Excel made the comment that kind of we're all in on that. And then we're reading continuous stories of issues with Excel being able to handle getting solar permits in. So I find it interesting and kind of where this is all going and with what our charge is going to be. I know it's more just in line with being EV ready or PV ready and EV ready, but you know, with the idea that it's going to go to full getting the systems in. Those are just my comments reading through both the media and the public comments. Thanks.
Thanks, Tim. Carolyn, I'll pass it to you.
Yeah, I just wanted to appreciate Tim's comment, but just kind of offer some perspective on that. You know, again, we're talking about new construction codes, which represents a small fraction of the total building stock. And these new homes are going to be much more efficient than the existing housing stock that we have. And so I don't think we should get hung up on that concern of like, will the grid be ready? I think will the grid be ready comes with what we do to the, you know, 90% of buildings that were built before this code existed, and they have to retrofit those, which is a little outside our scope. So I just, you know, if you look at what my 2017 house uses compared to an all electric new home built under a 2021 code, what it uses is going to be less, even, you know, across the board. So, I mean, with the envelope and improvements and such. So I know there's a lot of chatter about it, but I'm not particularly concerned about that in terms of the new construction code.
Thank you, Carolyn. And Kristen, I saw your hand up and then came back down. Did you want to add anything?
I just wanted to thank everyone who submitted public comments and let you know that those were appreciated, and I personally learned a lot. So thank you again.
Awesome. Okay. And then just one final clarification from David in the chat, just making sure we all see this before we move on. A chairperson may call for a show of hands, voice vote, or roll call vote. No proxy or absentee voting shall be allowed. In circumstances when the board is not able to convene, a vote by email, phone, or similar method may occur. When this occurs, the record of the vote will be maintained until the minutes recording the vote have been approved. In general, voting during regular meetings is preferred. Thank you for finding that, David.
You're welcome. Happy to answer any questions about it, but I think it's pretty straightforward.
And to clarify, we do not have any plans for any irregular meetings that will require votes outside of normal meetings. But so just so everyone is aware that the intent is to have all votes occur during regular meetings.
Thanks, Adam. Okay, any other final thoughts or comments on the public comments or code proposals that we've received, or any final questions on voting? Hearing none, I will move us on along. So now we're going to dive into our discussion to wrap up commercial EV ready codes. So as you guys recall from our last meeting, I guess I'll keep it here for a minute, we discussed in depth the space allocation component of this code and spent a lot of time talking about where we wanted those percentages to fall for both commercial and multifamily. So we sent out an EV survey to get your guys' opinions on where you guys thought the percentages should fall. And so we'll review those results together and then would love to open up the floor for discussion to see if you guys as a board can land on one option that we can move forward with. So these are the results for commercial buildings. Now to orient you to this slide very quickly, the first choice, so this was a ranking question. So we asked everyone to rank their first, second, third, and fourth choice for how these spaces should be allocated. So the first choice, you can see the darker green here indicates the highest score for each first, second, third, fourth choice. And then these are the options up here. So we've got the percentage of EV capable, EV ready, and EV installed spaces. And now over on this side, we have the weighted score. And so what SurveyMonkey does, which is really helpful, is in ranking questions, they'll give a weighted score for each option that is basically the combined score of everybody's choices, whether it was first, second, third, or fourth for that option, to kind of provide a sense, if we didn't come to an agreement on the first choice, which of the options received the highest number of votes, highest number of high ranking votes. So for commercial, we had the first choice, which was the first choice was option 3, 10% EV capable, 5% EV ready, 5% EV installed, followed closely by option 4, which was 18% EV capable, 2% EV installed. But if we look over here at the weighted scores, option 2 had the highest weighted score of all of the options, meaning that between the first ranking choices and the second ranking and the third ranking choices, all of the weighted averages of those choices gave that option the highest point value. So option 2 and option 3 received sort of the highest overall weighted score. Okay, and then I'm going to go through 2 more slides, and then we'll go back to this one and open it up for discussion. So within the commercial EV ready code, we also broke out parking lots that are 10 spaces or less and parking lots that are greater than 10 spaces. And so we included within the survey a question if you agreed or disagreed with this statement. For small parking lots with 10 or less spaces, providing 1 EV capable and 1 EV installed space was recommended. And then anything greater than 10 follows the space allocation percentages. So we had 11 out of 15 respondents agree. We had 2 folks that did not agree. And then these are some of the comments that were left for the EV ready code language. The calculation for greater than 10 spaces should round up. So just kind of a note on how we structure the language. Built incentives for fast chargers, but understand the statute requires 20%, so it'd be difficult to allow having fewer in exchange for a fast charger. That we consider exceptions for quick transaction businesses, drop off or pickup, where parking spaces may only be occupied for a few minutes. A recommendation that it be 1 EV ready and 1 EV capable, so not as to require a charging station. These lots may, very small lots may not be conducive to actual charging, so forcing the install may not be appropriate. Couple more comments. These are our last 2 on commercial. I think it might make more sense to push a bit further and push parking lots to have more than 1 EV SE installed. I'd like to see a minimum of 2 EV SE installed spots for most parking lots. Also wondering if the 20% threshold is too low. It certainly seems too low for the Front Range cities. Might be appropriate for more rural areas of the state. I'm wondering if there's any way to regulate things differently based on the population density of a given jurisdiction. And then the final comment we received here is, this will be almost impossible for large lots or special event venues. We don't require gas stations at every parking lot, and yet we have all survived. Also, the power needs for large lots will be massive and unaffordable. So those were all the thoughts we received from folks in the survey, and I'll just leave these survey results up and open it up for board discussion. So Carolyn, I see your hand up. I'll pass it to you first.
Yeah, it occurred to me as you were reading through these that the equipment is usually a dual ported or dual head charger when we're talking about level 2 charging spaces, and so the single equipment tends to serve two spaces, and so just thinking of that clarification when we talk about the code, I just wanted to name that. And then I'll just offer my advocacy for the comment I made on the 10 or less spaces. I did not advocate for requiring the actual charger to be installed in those very small lots, but I do advocate that at least one or some portion of it be EV ready, which wasn't like a choice within the question. And so I don't want to give up on EV ready and just go to capable, but I don't feel we should necessarily require an actual charger. And I saw somebody else say the quick transition businesses. That's specifically what was in my mind as well. So I just wanted to name that as kind of where I'm at.
Thank you, Carolyn. Kristen.
I have a question for some folks. It seemed from the survey, and I don't know when you're ready to go back to that most people preferred the options that were more heavily weighted toward EV ready and EVSE, which are, of course, the options where there's actually chargers available for people to use, or more readily available for people to use. And when I was thinking about this, part of what I was contemplating was, how fast is the EVSE technology evolving? And is there any risk that, there will be some obsolescence that might, make people prefer to choose one of the other options? But then at the same time, I was also thinking, well, from a utility standpoint, it actually does make sense to require more, be connected in a way that could potentially be easier to integrate with load shedding incentives. Just curious what people were thinking, if they were struggling to choose between options 2 and 3, and why you chose the way you did.
Yeah, thanks, Kristen. Carolyn?
Yeah, I wasn't so much concerned about technology obsolescence. I think we haven't seen a different power requirement. I think we've seen, you either have a Tesla or anything else with the charging technology. So I wasn't as concerned about that. I think between these two, they were tough. In my mind, they were tough to pick from. And I don't remember which order I put them in, but they were 1 and 2. Because exactly what you said is making sure that we have a good number that are at least easily adaptable to add charging to if we don't require the equipment, especially given the fact that we're only in the 20% category on the commercial. I was willing to push a higher percentage towards easier to accommodate charging infrastructure if necessary, even if we didn't require all of those to actually have charging hardware installed at the time of construction. And then I can also speak that option 4 was my lowest for that reason as well.
Yeah, thank you. And I also appreciate you noting that you can have 1 charger serve 2 spots. So when we talk about 20%, really that's perhaps fewer chargers than people are originally envisioning.
Yeah, it's 1 piece of hardware for 2 spaces and one outlet for 2 spaces. And so just thinking about that nuance when we think about this, I think is really helpful.
Thank you, guys. Any other thoughts on where this landed and any advocacy for one option or another? I'm not hearing much. So I guess it seems to me that option 2 and option 3 seem to be the options to select between right now. 1 requires a higher level of EV installed equipment, 5% versus 2%, and the same amount of EV capable. And for option 2, instead of that 5% EV installed, those get thrown into EV ready. I would love to know how people feel between those 2, or if you want to throw your hat out for a different one. Just make sure we hear a lot of voices on this matter. Yeah, Elizabeth.
Sure, I'll throw my hat out there first. I think if I'm remembering right, I also 2 and 3 were my favorites, and I think I voted for option 2 for our commercial, only because I don't think that having a charging station on site is necessarily the driving factor to people purchasing the electric vehicle. That's still going to be more multifamily driven, because this is not the multifamily chart, right? This is the non-residential chart, right? Yeah. So I don't and your original question about, okay, well, what's the real difference between 2 and 3? It's the first cost. So that it is a bigger jump cost-wise between EV ready and EV installed. And And if that's, if we're not getting the effect of, encouraging people to purchase that electric vehicle or make that jump, then I'm not sure it has as much of a benefit as just getting the power on site. And if the market then drives that addition of extra chargers to be installed, then I think that's great, but that's going to be driven by the people who already have the electric vehicles. You know what I mean? Like they're not going to be telling their office building, that they're not going to buy that electric vehicle until there's a charger there. They're going to be asking their office building to install it after they already own one. So I don't see that as a driving factor in the same way that it is for multifamily. That was why I chose 2 over 3.
Great. Yeah. Thank you, Elizabeth.
I'm going to second Elizabeth's ordering.
That's a similar rationale for me as well. Thanks, Kevin.
Similar thoughts for me too.
Yeah, I think that thinking makes sense to me.
Okay. Thank you, guys. Jason, I saw your thumbs up there. Thanks for throwing that. Is there anybody who has concerns around option 2 that wants to share those and flesh those out with the board? Just want to make sure everyone's got time to think.
I'll go ahead and chime in here. I've given this a tremendous amount of thought, and the poor side of the state that I speak from, I just get concerned about cost. We've got, I understand we're talking new construction, we're talking new builds, but as we get these older areas that are looking to refurbish and upgrade, these standards are going to fall upon them. And I'm concerned we create ghost towns of our existing downtown areas with restrictions that are just too expensive. So that's just my concern as we move forward here.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that, Don. Any other thoughts on this piece for this? Yeah, Kim.
I'll just share that I'm also from a rural region, although more tourist oriented. And there's definitely a concern for us that if we don't have enough EV infrastructure installed, that it will deter people from visiting and spending their tourism dollars in our communities. So I'd say for the rural regions, it's maybe mixed as far as what those influences would be, but also just the travel, and if people are wanting to travel away from cities to come to more rural areas and they are uncertain whether they can charge their vehicle, that would be a hindrance. So just kind of wanted to speak that opinion too.
Yeah, thank you, Kim. Okay. Well, I don't want to belabor this point. It feels like I'm hearing some general consensus around option 2. And so with that in mind, I think we can move forward with that as the percentage values for our commercial EV ready. The one thing I do want to touch on or cover before we move on to multifamily is this discussion here for small parking lots with 10 spaces or less. And Carolyn touched on this, advocating that instead of it being 1 EV capable and 1 EV installed, that it be 1 EV capable and 1 EV ready space for parking lots that are 10 spaces or less. We needed a minimum of 2 spaces in this scenario in order to cover the 20% threshold. But does anybody else want to share their thoughts on how the small lots, the requirements that they think should be in place for small lots? Tim.
Yeah, thank you. I would be in concurrence with that. 1 EV ready and 1 EV capable. I totally agree with these small lots, 10 or less. That'd be very appropriate, in my opinion.
Great, thank you, Tim. Any other thoughts? Adam and then Aaron.
I'm just wondering if perhaps we could provide, opportunities for, an EVSE being the requirement, perhaps, but approach it with an opportunity for an exemption for certain circumstances, just because I'm thinking of, certain buildings, commercial buildings in, like, say, Denver or other high density areas where, there might be things like restaurants or other, grocery stores or things that don't have significantly large parking lots, but that still have clientele who will spend a significant amount of time there and would be interested in charging. So I'm wondering, if either we could include the EVSE installed requirement, but then perhaps have some exemption about, length of stay of, length of parking at that, at a facility or something. Just wondering what people might think of that.
Yeah, thanks, Adam. I'll pass it to Aaron and then if anyone wants to respond.
So for the small lots, I mean, we're talking about 2 spaces, and I think there's an opportunity to simplify here because a dual port charging station is going to cover it. So rather than splitting hairs between one EV capable, one EVSE, just doing one thing, whether it's EV ready or an EVSE space, just, yeah, I mean, it's going to be 2 spots anyway. So I think maybe just connecting this more to how it will actually play out.
Yeah, thanks, Aaron. And I think that's a helpful reminder. Per our definitions in state statute, an EV ready space is both spaces on either side of wherever the electrical conduit ends. So I think that's a really helpful note. Thanks, Aaron. Elizabeth and then Carolyn.
Yeah, I think part of and I'm in support of how this is written with the one EV ready and one EV capable. A lot of times the small lots are not the traditional, just 2 spots parallel to each other. These could be street spots. Remember, this is for all provided parking. And usually with small lots, there's just a lot of weirdness. So you may not have 2 spots next to each other, or they might be, tandem spots, like where you have to parallel park, where you could not have a single charging station that could adequately serve 2 spaces. So I think I prefer the flexibility here, keep it minimal, because there's just too many what ifs to mandate something that's higher.
Thanks, Elizabeth. Carolyn, and then Tim.
I wanted to offer my support of Aaron's note and modify my recommendation to have 2 EV ready spaces. And then to Adam's question, I think I would look to our CBOs on the board to really understand how that type of exemption would really be addressed, or if it's too ambiguous and opens it up for something else. I can't speak to that specifically. I tend to think that adding the charging station after doesn't have an incremental cost. The first cost of the charger is still the first cost of the charger, provided the electrical infrastructure is there. And so if it's suitable to have charging, I think it will have charging, or it's easy enough to adapt. But that's why I'm advocating for EV ready, which again wasn't one of our choices when answering this particular question.
Yeah, thanks, Carolyn. Tim, and then Ron, and then Elizabeth.
Yeah, thank you. Well, try to answer that question, but first, my comment to Adam's comment of, I think, length of stay in these types of facilities, and in my opinion, if it's say a food market, so it's which would be with a small parking lot, or these various restaurants, or even like a retail store, I think the length of stay for the customers is going to be pretty short. Even if you go out to eat, it's pretty, you're kind of getting pushed out of your table in about an hour and a half, just to kind of get you moving and open up the table. And the smaller lots are supporting smaller businesses. So if you were going to be supplying some sort of charger, it'd have to be like the top of the line quick charger, or people are not going to use it for the slow charger. So, and then from a standpoint, from a AHJ, a building official, with like exemptions, then I think that just like anything, that end up being a case by case situation. So I think we should keep the language pretty general and not get into specifics, in my opinion.
Thanks, Tim. Ron, I'll pass it to you.
Yeah, this length of stay thing, I think gets pretty complicated pretty quickly. I know, we have an electric vehicle, and sometimes we have gotten to the batteries drained pretty far, and we're looking to just top us off a little bit to make us feel more comfortable to get our way home, and pulling into some place and charging for 45 minutes or an hour actually might do the trick. The place where I think it gets complicated from an enforcement perspective is that if you have a business, let's say it's a restaurant, but then maybe they switch gears and they stop seating people in the restaurant, and now they're doing takeout, or vice versa, where they were doing takeout and now they're going to open up some tables for sitting. All of a sudden, that makes it where now maybe the length of stay is radically shifting. And it does seem like to me like it could get pretty complicated trying to regulate the parking spaces by the length of stay to that fine level.
Yeah, thank you, Ron. Elizabeth?
Yeah, I also just want to remind everyone when we do think about first cost, whether we're installing a charger or not, your local utility can only rebate things that are not mandatory. So I do tend to lean towards the installation requirements that are the hardest to retrofit. It's very easy to retrofit a charger itself once everything else is there. And I still like kind of letting that be market driven, and whether that restaurant wants to install one, because at that point it becomes an amenity, like valet parking or something like that. It's an attractor, but I still like the idea of letting them get the grants, get the rebates without it being mandatory, and that just makes it much more affordable for everyone.
Yeah, thanks, Elizabeth. Brad.
Yeah, thank you, everybody. So just to provide a point to what Carolyn had said earlier about two charging options within a station, I'll say that we've had several installed recently, and we're seeing some single cable installs. So there is a fair amount of that. I can actually almost see one from my desk right now. And then to kind of the time to charge or length of the charge, I just want to advocate for the quick transaction option down below. It is something that we have implemented in Fort Collins and something that we've used, and the determination is typically just made at the building official level or at plan review level. It's not really too difficult to discern what would be considered a quick transaction. When I spoke to this in front of our boards and in front of our council, we used the example of a Little Caesars pizza. So typically people are pulling in and within 5 minutes are driving off. So there are a fair number of those businesses out there, and it was a pretty easy exception for us to include within our code. And it's written almost as it's seen on the screen here. So left a little bit vague, but recognizing that the determination would be made at plan review or by a building official, and it's been pretty simple so far.
Thanks, Brad. And just to make sure I'm understanding, does that mean that those spaces that are used for quick transition businesses are exempt from the total lot? Like those are subtracted off of the total number of parking spaces? Is that?
It's specific to that business, like that business would be required to provide a certain number of spaces, and that's what we base that off of. So depending on the occupancy and the size of the building, there might be 4 parking spaces assigned to that. And because it's a quick transaction business, picture a Little Caesars, we have eliminated that requirement.
Okay, thank you. Carolyn.
And follow up for Brad, because you started to get my question, I was trying to get if that exception is to this, if you would have the same feeling about that exception if it didn't require EVSE, or if it does require EVSE, and which you would advocate applying the exception to. Is it the Okay, the EVSE equipment, or is it the entire requirement?
I could jump in,
Yeah,
have
Brad, go
Elizabeth
for it.
here. So what we have done is exempted it entirely. I think looking back and having more information now than we did then, I think capable would seem to make a little bit of a sense there, and not so much the EVSE.
Thanks, Brad. And Elizabeth, go to you.
Yeah, the only challenge I see with considering exceptions is that a lot of those exceptions that are related to a business purpose are not permanent. You know, businesses change. Little Caesars could change to a yoga studio or a bank or whatever. That's not something that can be tied to a specific business. We have to tie things to buildings and parking spaces, not business purposes.
Thanks, Elizabeth. Okay, so I am here. What I've heard so far is general advocacy for two different options, 2 EV ready or 1 EV ready, 1 EV capable. I think I'm hearing a little bit more justification and perhaps support for 1 EV ready and 1 EV capable, thinking that it might help some of these quick transition or transaction businesses save upfront costs. Some that Brad, you're seeing a lot of single cable installs, not dual port installs for some of those chargers. So having the different requirements would make sense, and that parking lots can just be kind of funky when it comes to these small lots. So allowing flexibility within these requirements. So generally speaking, does that feel like I've captured what you guys are feeling? 1 EV capable, 1 EV ready. Does anyone in this room think, no, Kim, what are you thinking? That's not right. Tim, pass it to you.
Yeah, I got a question for, I guess, the group. So if we had a requirement, or we will have a requirement for EV ready and EV capable, but not installation. So, and Ron, maybe you can help me out from a CBO standpoint, but in my opinion, the way the building code would read and enforced, at least in Broomfield, would be if a person wanted to install the charging system, we would require a permit. And it's my understanding, if it was a installed charging station in the International Building Code right now for the 2018 and the 2021, you would have to require a minimum of 1 accessible space for that. But when I reached out to ICC, my contact with International Code Council, and what she thought would be what would happen with an EV ready or EV capable space, would that then need to require the accessible space when we install these, or would that have to be done when that charging station comes in? And her opinion from ICC standpoint was you wouldn't require an accessible space when it's just EV ready or EV capable, but it would have to be turned into an accessible space at the minimum requirement when you issued the permit for putting in the station, the charging station. So I know that's not in the ordinance, but from an enforcement standpoint from building officials, that's how that would have to be, which means then apparently I would think then the building owner would have to restripe the parking lot. And then you essentially lose a parking space because you got to have a striped 5-foot access aisle next to a van accessible size. So that, I guess that wasn't quite a question, but that was a comment.
Tim, I think you bring up a really complicated issue, and which is the way that the accessibility requirements feed into the EV requirements, and these two things do seem like they create a variety of scenarios that may not have been contemplated by either set of rules. I know there's an organization that's working on this from a transportation perspective and coming up with some guidelines about what best practices might look like for dealing with electric vehicle charging and accessibility simultaneously. They're talking about maybe prioritizing spots. So they maybe there's spots that serve dual functions somehow. But I do think it can get messy pretty quickly. And I also think that you're right that, a building permit, unless they happen to put in like a 220 receptacle and they're plugging in the EVSE as a standalone listed device, which I don't think is common, but I could imagine that happening. If they do anything besides that, then they would need a permit to install that. And then you run right into this accessibility question.
Thanks, Ron. Thanks, Tim. And Carolyn, I'll pass it to you.
Yeah, I was just wondering, Kim, if you could do another round of voting and tallying around this topic with a few options that are more expansive than the original one that might help get at this. I would advocate for 2 EV ready spaces. I could be, I could see one EV ready, one EV capable. But then I think this, does the EVSE need to be there? Maybe another option, and just to get more of a pulse of where people are at. I do think that I do think we can address the accessible space, whether it's EV ready or EVSE, by requiring it to be located near an accessible space. If it's EV ready, like specifying that the location for the terminated junction box or outlet is located near an accessible space.
Yeah, Ron.
I'll just add one other piece of this, which is it's not, to me, completely clear that when we talk about accessible spacing, we're talking about a protocol and a guideline for how you create an accessible space that really contemplates the use of an electric vehicle charging in an accessible situation. So, could somebody who is, let's say, in a wheelchair, could they actually get to the EVSE charger, operate the device, reach the plugs, plug it in, and not have the cords blocking themselves? It seems like there's some work to do to really come up with some guidelines that work for that.
Thanks, Tim. Yeah, sorry. Thank you, Ron. Tim.
So the requirements in the International Building Code in the 21, they've added this language in that says you supply the charging stations, you need to have at least 2% minimum of one accessible space. And the requirement for the accessible parking space is a van accessible space, which is the actual space is 8 foot wide with a 5-foot striped access aisle for a total of 13 feet. So I know we had the discussion early on talking about meeting, some kind of language in there to meet the accessibility requirements, but we might consider putting a little more detail in, so that when you're doing, whether it's EV ready or EV capable, that we add that possibly that 21 code language in for the requirement for the parking space to go along with it. And then the maximum height of the charging station cannot be any higher than 48 inch. So, and it's my understanding you can't share that with the required just regular accessible parking space. You'd have to create separate ones, which is going to take more real estate when it comes down to it.
Yeah, Kevin.
Yeah, Tim, you just landed on a good point that I mentioned maybe last meeting about Denver's requirement being pretty onerous right now, and that they actually have a 16-foot wide requirement for an accessible, they call it a universal space. So it's a 10-foot space, 3-foot side aisles either side, and then some complications about how and where the charger can be located relevant to that. And it doesn't count as an accessible space anymore. So from a parking garage point of view, it's a space killer for sure. It's, creates an extremely inefficient parking condition. structural grids and all of that for structured parking are it gets even worse. So if we have something like that, I guess I'd advocate that there's equivalency between this universal space or how you access it, but like make sure it's not two separate buckets of an accessible space and then an accessible charging space. I think that's where Denver was going, but maybe they didn't realize the unintended consequence of them being totally separate spaces. So I'd advocate to avoid doing that, please.
Okay, yeah, thanks, Kevin. All right, so Carolyn, to address your point, I don't think within our process of drafting our code language and getting it to our technical advisors, we necessarily have time for another offline survey around where we would fall with the parking allocation for 10 spaces or less. So between sort of the, you know, I guess, how does the board want me to, we can do like a voice vote right now. If you guys would like to sort of throw your hands up for what you guys are advocating for within this. But I don't think we'll have time to do an after vote. So Carolyn, does that seem like maybe we could do a quick voice vote and see how people are falling?
That's fine. Or I was just going to empower you to draft off of whatever gets your weighted highest score. I would have been fine with that too. So either way.
Okay. Thanks. And Tim, yeah, I see your hands up.
Yeah, thank you again. Good point, Kevin. Thank you. But I would still just like to make it clear from a building department standpoint that if we have in our requirements, wherever we end up with, say, how many EFSE spaces are required, that assuming you're under the 2021 International Building Code, we would be required to have the parking lot provide at least 1 or 2% if you have more. So that's going to be embedded in the kind of what happens with these new requirements when it ends up being enforced across the state. And second is it would be up to the building department to choose how they enforce the accessibility requirements, say from a retrofit standpoint. In other words, on an EV ready or EV capable, when they process a permit to put that in, then they can choose. So that might not need to be in this ordinance, but it's just going to be up to the authority having jurisdiction on, do they enforce it or do they choose not to based on whatever. But at least from the EFSE, that's going to be embedded, but by a different code as it's adopted in the 21. So that's trying to keep that clear with everybody from an enforcement standpoint.
Yeah, thanks, Tim. I think it's a really important point. So let's just do a quick straw poll from folks on the call. So if you guys could raise your hands when a vote comes along that you like. Well, I'm going to throw out every option. So 2 EV capable, 1 EV ready, 1 EV capable, 2 EV ready, 1 EV capable, 1 EV installed, 1 EV ready, 1 EV installed. Okay. So
you
those
want
are
us to vote for just one or any of
Wait.
them that we could be amenable to?
I think please pick your top one, because otherwise we'll get it'll get messy with the voting. Okay. So I'm going to
say that again. The options. Sorry.
No, that's okay. I just want to make sure I'm covering all of our bases. So I'm going to start with our 2 most popular, which were 2 EV ready spaces, 1 EV ready, 1 EV capable, 2 EV capable. So 2 EV capable, 2 EV ready, 1 split between those. 1 EV capable, 1 EV installed, 1 EV ready, 1 EV installed. Does everybody understand?
I'm a visual person. I can't hear that and make a choice. Is there a way we could write that on the screen or chat or something?
Yep, I see Allie is already on it, typing these options into the chat. So we'll give her a minute to throw those in there. And then we'll ask everybody to vote for their top option. Thank you, Allie, for doing that.
Thank you.
And thanks for bearing with us while we do this quick straw poll to make sure we're capturing your guys' feedback correctly. Okay.
And just clarifying, this is only for the 10 or less spaces. What's on screen right now, right?
Yes, that's correct. It'll be for the requirements for 10 spaces or less. Okay, so the options are from Allie in the chat. There are 5 options. So we'll just go with the top and vote only for one. Please only cast your vote once. So number 1 is 2 EV ready spaces. Please raise your hand if this is the requirement that you like. One, two, three, 4. Okay, just giving everyone a chance. Okay, great. Number 2, 1 EV ready and 1 EV capable space. For those of you off camera, I haven't seen yet, just making sure you guys are voting for the ones that look the best to you. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Okay, I'm counting 7. Awesome, thank you guys. Number 3 is 2 EV capable spaces. So if you had your hand up for the last one, please take your hand down for this one. Okay, I've got 3 for that. Okay, thank you, Don, Tom, everybody. Number 4, 1 EV capable, 1 EV installed. Seeing no votes. Okay, number 5, 1 EV ready, 1 EV installed. Okay, so we've got 3, 1, 2, 3. 3 for that. Okay. So my results are, and Allie or Claire, maybe you guys can capture this and throw it in the chat. 4 votes for option number 1, 7 votes for option number 2, 3 votes for option number 3, and 3 votes for option number 5, which means the majority of votes, and I think the one that balances sort of all of the options is number 2, which is 1 EV ready and 1 EV capable space got the majority. And Kim, thanks for that. So that would change option number 5. No, option number 1 got 5 votes instead of 4 votes. And
Can we narrow it down to the top 2, and then those of us who had our main choices eliminated reallocate, or are we not doing ranked choice voting here? Because I think some of the other options, like those of us who voted for 5, might prefer 1. Just throwing that out there.
Yeah, Kristen, I'm happy to do that if that's what would be, if that would be a good process for the board. I'm seeing some general head nods. So our top 2 choices from that original voting were option 1, 2 EV ready spaces, or option 2, 1 EV ready, 1 EV capable. So let's do a new vote. There are 2 options. They're going to stay the same number, option 1, option 2. So please raise your hand if you would like to see, or if you would prefer 2 EV ready spaces. Raise your hand now. Okay, I'm counting 10 for number 1. If you guys can all throw your hands down, thank you, everyone who voted. And then for number 2, which is 1 EV ready, 1 EV capable space, please put your hands up for option number 2. Okay, we have 8 votes for number 2. So by way of simple majority, and again, this is not, this is just the initial voting that will help us draft the code language. The 2 EV ready spaces won simple majority here. Again, I will say everybody will have a final chance to vote and actually vote on what they'd like to see included in the code language requirements. So for those of you who voted for 1 EV ready, 1 EV capable, if you really feel very strongly when we get to that point where we're voting, if we don't reach the 2/3 consensus, there could be some advocacy one way or the other to make sure that we reach wherever the board wants to fall with that. So just based on the guidance from that straw poll, we'll draft our language around 2 EV ready spaces. But again, know that this is not the final vote. This is not the final chance to share your opinion on where we land with this. Okay, well, thank you all for voting and sharing your thoughts on that. We'll now move on to the multifamily discussion because we have a couple more pieces to wrap up with EV. So starting fresh here, remember we're moving on to multifamily, where we heard from, generally speaking, from the board at our last meeting that you guys were interested in going above the 20% threshold. So the options we presented in the survey between EV capable, EV ready, and EV installed went up to 30%. And so between these first 3 options, and then we also added a new category of EV spaces, which we're calling EV capable light. And that's what the EVCL means. So thank you for bearing with us as we use acronyms to save space on these slides. So that EV capable light space, pretty much, as you guys might recall, is running conduit, but not, and saving physical space for additional electrical capacity, but not installing or requiring any electrical panel space or branch circuits or anything like that for these spaces. It's just simply running the conduit. So in all of our options, we tossed out, for this first question, we had 10% of spaces as assigned as EV capable light. So we'll talk first about the breakdown of capable ready EV installed on this slide, and then we'll move into the discussion on how many light spaces we want to assign for multifamily. So similarly, our first choice, we had a dead even split between option 1 and option 2. The biggest differences between option 1 and option 2 are that a large chunk of the EV capable in option 1 moved to EV ready in option 2. So option 2 has a higher percentage of EV ready than option 1. If we look at the weighted scores, option 2, again, this is taking into account everybody who voted for that option, whether it be first, second, or third choice, came out with the highest weighted score. So we were dead split for first choice, with the high majority of folks having their second choice be this option 2 here. So with that in mind, I will open it up for board discussion. Any thoughts, comments? Anyone want to advocate for one option over the other here? Sorry, I lost my unmute button. Yes, Elizabeth, go for it.
I'll throw my hat out there again first. I think if I'm remembering right, I voted for option 2. It's like I said, I think that having the ability, or having the charger installed, or the ability to install the charger quickly is the most impactful thing that can sway someone to go all electric, or go electric in their vehicle choice. And so that gives you basically 20% of your building that is ready to go. And that felt to me like a good number. I may have put my second choice as option 3 because now it's 25%. But it also felt like an odd split to be 5% EV capable and 20% EV ready. And that almost felt like too far. So I kind of settled in the middle there as option 2 as my first choice. But I preferred that over option 1, only because while there's not a big cost between EV capable and EV ready, like there's very little cost increase there. Having it already there where you can just very quickly do a plug and play charger, I think is a pretty big deal. So it's not a cost hurdle necessarily to get that charger installed, but it does become, a little trickier to do the labor and stuff like that if you do have to pull the wire in your existing conduit. So for quick adoption, I liked option 2 is my mental happy place.
Great, thank you, Elizabeth. We'll go to Tim next.
Yeah, thank you. I'm still wondering, I know we had this discussion, maybe it was last meeting or so, but about the required distribution and how that comes into play with this survey with the requirements, because to me, they go hand in hand in terms of how we're going to distribute what we're going to require. And in particular with, the attached garages on a lot of apartments that we see.
Yeah, thanks, Tim. So that's coming on a slide. We did ask the question if the board was interested in having specific language for the commercial multifamily that got at the distribution piece. So we'll have a chance to dive into that in a bit in one more slide. Rob, I'll go to you next.
Yeah, hi. So one thing that our EV team actually raised that I thought was kind of an interesting point, and when we're talking about being weighted more heavily towards EV ready, is the risk if that infrastructure is waiting around for years to actually be implemented, is the risk of actually theft, of people going in and tearing out copper conductor, things like that, to because it's just sitting there and ready. So I think that's why it was our preference to be a little bit more weighted towards EV capable for EV ready.
I'm sorry, I was talking on mute. Thanks, Rob. That was very interesting. Don, I'll pass it over to you.
I'm going to promote option number one. Rob brought up a really good point. I hadn't really thought about the theft issue, but I mean, I think for multifamily, there's just so many possibilities of what space needs it, what space doesn't need it, allocated parking. There's a lot of issues there. So I just think the more space is EV capable and less worrying about the ones to be EV ready, I think is the best option for this.
And I do want to add, I didn't get my hand. I mean, we have similar concerns on a smaller scale for the non-residential piece as well.
Thanks, Rob. Okay, so I'm hearing two advocates for option one advocate for option two. Do others on the board want to share their opinion on which option they voted for and why? Yeah, Adam.
I'm happy to weigh in. I think we've kind of talked about it a little bit about, when we were talking in the commercial context about the differences in terms of need and in incentive for folks to purchase an EV. I think, someone commented about, I think it might've been Elizabeth, I don't remember who, about the fact that, charging stations available in commercial parking lots are not going to be what drives people to, buy an EV or not. It's going to be whether or not, for the most part, whether or not they can charge at home. And so I think that I would opt for option two over option one, in that you're providing more opportunity and more confidence for folks to know that there will be easier opportunities for them to get charging as we get that higher and higher penetration of EVs at home. So I think on the commercial side, I was more comfortable with leaving more capable, but I think, as we are recognizing that there's going to be a really high penetration of EVs coming in the next couple of decades, and that home charging is one of the main considerations for folks in purchasing an EV, that we really need to be leaning towards that higher number of spaces being able to be more easily transitioned to charging stations.
Thank you, Adam. Jason.
I don't really know how to think about the theft. I did consider that and wondered if that, what kind of prevalence that would have over the next, years as it's waiting to get installed. But I'll echo kind of what Adam was saying as well, and to Director Torres, the results that are going to be coming out on what to expect in 2030, 2040, 2050, as far as how many EVs. I think, having a robust multifamily EV ready allocation is important to support the EVs that are coming online in, shortly. But I think another thing to think about is just, our ability to sort of drive EV adoption through these robust allocations. So, we have a little bit of, we're kind of like, we have the ability to push towards even higher adoption than what's being forecasted. And so I just wanted to mention that.
Yeah, thank you, Jason. We'll go to Rob and then Carolyn.
Yeah, I want to add that, it goes without saying, because I'm sure we're all thoroughly aware that Colorado being a home rule state, any jurisdiction is welcome to be more restrictive than what we propose. So I want to make sure that we keep that in mind as we move forward, that we need to think about the state and that jurisdictions can go further than this.
Yeah, thank you, Rob. Great point. Carolyn and then Brad.
Yeah, so I don't remember which way I voted. We've got experience in Boulder of 10% EV ready. That would make me lean towards the 15%. Rather than sacrificing some of the EV ready. Definitely would not push towards more than the 15% though, for I think Rob's point.
Thanks, Carolyn. Brad.
Thanks, and really good points made so far. And I certainly see myself kind of aligning in agreement with more EV ready. It does have me sort of questioning, are we providing enough EV capable? And one of the reasons, I'm kind of thinking this, and of course, to Rob's point, and some others have made this similar point, is that, jurisdictions can certainly go above and beyond this. We have in Fort Collins, we have a considerably higher percentage, I think, than anything we see here. Couple of points on that. We've had very little resistance from developers and builders so far in our percentages, and our percentages are higher, 40% EV capable as an example. And we've heard from some developers that there is a desire for that. It is future proofing of their developments. Another consideration that I hadn't thought of, but I have now, is that a lot of our multifamily properties often change hands shortly after being built. Typically they get through a year of warranty period and then they sell, and another investor comes in and purchases the property. So what's the likelihood that somebody would come in, 5 years, 10 years down the road and then decide that they're going to build in that infrastructure? Or is it an investment well made up front if they see that this infrastructure is already in place? Does that increase the value of that from an investor perspective?
Yeah, interesting. And thanks for providing that context on how developers have been reacting to Fort Collins requirements. Anyone else want to kind of throw out their hat in the ring for one of these, or share any additional perspective that lends itself one way or the other? Okay. So just based on who has spoken up, it sounds like option 2 had just a couple of additional advocates within the room. It also had the highest weighted score here. I think there are some really interesting points that were brought up around the preference for number 1 being cost, and also being a potential opportunity for theft, sort of stranded infrastructure. So I guess any other we will be basing our code language off of the input we get live right now in these meetings. So I want to make sure that anybody who has a thought to share on this is able to share before we move along. Kristen.
Curious why installed wasn't higher than 5% in any of the options.
Yeah, I think I think the biggest reason was keeping an eye on cost, trying to find the balance between lowest upfront cost and lowest retrofit cost. But if anybody wanted to advocate for a higher percentage there, we are happy to hear that. Carolyn.
And related question, we did answer something about more EVCL as well. Is that next?
Yes, that is next. Okay, well, I will move on to the EVCL options, and then if it sparks any new ideas around option 1, 2, or 3, again, really, we are very much interested in everybody's feedback here. So the things that we sort of the other piece to the multifamily EV readiness standards that we asked about was these EV capable light spaces. And so we started in all of our scenarios that you just saw with a baseline of 10% EV capable light spaces. The idea, again, behind these light spaces is so that you don't have to rip up an entire parking lot to get more conduit to run wire to additional EV spaces if needed in the future. But EV capable light stops short of providing the electrical capacity. So we asked, would you guys be interested in seeing 10% of spaces EV capable light, 20, 30, or 40%? And kind of how the results shook out here, you can see between the first choice, it was a pretty close tie between 10 and 30%. And then down here in the second choice, we have 20%, sort of that middle ground being everybody's second choice, or the majority of folks' second choice. When we look down or over here at the weighted scores, there was just a 0.5 difference in weighted score between a 20% threshold or a 30% threshold. Now, there could be a really easy way to just split it down the middle and say 25% EV capable light spaces to balance the thoughts between 20 and 30%. But want to leave this here and open it up for board to share their thoughts on where this landed and where you guys think this EV capable light percentage should fall. Don.
The way I'm looking at this, if anything, we should split the middle, between a 10 and 20%, or drop it down on that lower end. It's kind of interesting when you look at where this is at, that the 20% was smack dab in the middle of the first two options that were so closely voted on. I still think the 10% was the highest vote getter first choice, and should probably stay that way.
Okay, thanks, Don. And so you're saying advocate for 10%, but would be okay falling somewhere in the middle.
I advocate for the 10%. I get when we start figuring weighted scores, I feel like we're perhaps getting lost in the numbers and percentages a little bit too much. But I think the first choice, I mean, it wasn't a huge winner, but the first choice was the 10% for the most people. So
I don't think that that's accurate. I mean, 65% of people chose an option higher than 10% as their first choice.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say too. And if you look at also who voted against as far as their fourth choice, if you look at 10%, for half of everybody essentially voted against 10%, versus if you look at 20 and 30, nobody voted against that as their last choice for either 20 or 30. So, and if you look at those percentages in the middle of second and third choice, those are drastically higher. You're looking at 53 and 31 versus 6 for 10. And then for third choice, 29 and 38 versus 12. So, Don, I mean, I see what you're saying about the fact that 35 maybe was the highest for their first choice, but I don't think from a statistical perspective, even like that's an accurate or an appropriate way to look at it, is to just say, who had the plurality of votes, and that's the only thing that you consider when you look at what the rest of the results showed.
I had to try. It was worth an effort.
Yeah, thanks, Don. Tim, and then I'll go to Andrew.
Yeah, I'm sorry. And bear with me. Could you please explain again EVCL, the light? Is that just conduit being provided from what location to which location? Thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Tim. So EV capable light means that you're providing conduit from the electric panel to some space adjacent to the parking spaces that would be future EV capable. But again, where it stops short is you don't need to require the reserved panel capacity for the future install of those EV charging stations. It would require an electrical upgrade if you were to install EV chargers and run wire for these EV capable light spaces. Does that help?
Yeah, thank you. So with that, that's what I thought, but it was just nice to hear that again, I think, for me and the group. So I'd be advocating somewhere up into that 30 or 40% range, since it's just an infrastructure cost. And I know we had that discussion a little earlier just now and in the past meeting of at least this conduits would be in place, and for future upgrades, it would make it much less expensive for the owner to not have to go in and trench and dig up asphalt or concrete.
Yeah, thanks, Tim. Adam, I'll go to you, and then Elizabeth. Sorry, I skipped you last time your hand was up.
No problem. I think Carolyn just addressed what I was going to say in the chat. I think we had talked about, when we talked about EVCL last meeting, it doesn't require that the actual electrical capacity be there, but it does require that there be space reserved for the future electrical capacity. So for the transformers, the other electrical equipment. So I think I think what we're talking about that we all were kind of in agreement on last meeting was that it's the conduit and then the reserved physical space, but not the actual reserved capacity.
That's what my hand is up to. So I'm just gonna go ahead and put it down.
Great. Thank you both for making sure that clarification got in. Andrew, and then Brad. Andrew, it looks like your picture might be frozen on our end. Oh, there it goes.
Okay, so working there. Now, I had a general comment just on the posing of this question, that its intent seemed to be unclear to me as I took the questionnaire. That is the intent of this question to serve what purpose? And is the purpose to redo the cable that preceded it, in that the 10% that was proposed could be raised to 20, 30, or 40%? And if that was the intent, should it have been posed with more expanded choices in that question? Because I fundamentally don't, I see this as a way or a path to revisit. And if so, maybe it should be done more so and not just in this isolated instance. If anybody has any thought or feedback on that, it just stood out to me that it was serving some purpose, maybe as intended or more than intended. And I didn't like that it was intended to maybe go back and change responses that were already submitted.
Andrew, I'm happy to take a stab at answering that. So the first set of questions that was served to the board was this option between 1, 2, and 3. And we kept the 10% EV capable light consistent throughout, because really what we were asking you guys about, the goal of this first question was to understand how the board wanted to break down EV capable, EV ready, and EV installed spaces within the 30% threshold that we are assigning for those spaces. And that 30% threshold we came up with based on feedback from the board at our last meeting, that you guys wanted to go above 20% for multifamily. So our idea in splitting this up was really trying to simplify this question, because originally we had about 12 options in this question. with each one of these breakdowns for EV capable, ready, and installed that had an individual different EV capable light threshold. So I hope that that makes sense. The reason we pulled out the question on EV capable light was so that this question could really get to what we were after, which was trying to figure out how to break down these three space types. And then we wanted to ask, okay, kind of with that understanding and knowing that within these options, there will be some minimum threshold of EV capable light. How far do we want to take the EV capable light requirements? And so that's where this part 2 of the question came in. But I'm happy to, does that help, Andrew? Does that make more sense?
It does help. It does beg what comes next. As far as does the question get reposed with fewer choices? And if so, does it get reposed now or does that come later?
So I think my goal in today's meeting is to get enough input from you guys that we can draft the first iteration of this code language. Because of our tight timeline, we don't have the opportunity to send another EV survey out. So what I'm trying to gain from everybody today is, between these 3 options, which breakdown do you prefer? And then how far do you want to take the EV capable light requirement? Because really all it's doing is saying, instead of 30% of space is covered, we're going to 40%, or we're going to 50%, or we're going to 60%, or we're going to 70%. And so I think my hope is that we can flush the discussion out enough today that we don't need to do another survey. So I think that's the goal and the trajectory. Okay, Brad, I'll pass it over to you, and then Adam, you next.
Thanks. I just wanted to sort of make sure that within the EVCL that it is part of the language that we would include that extra space within the electrical closet. And the reason, of course, is we went through this, and this was a bit of a hard lesson learned in Fort Collins. We hadn't accounted for this, and when we had further outreach, some of the members of the community, specifically architects, some electrical engineers, and some electricians, that was probably the biggest factor in this. It's pretty easy to adapt sizing, but of the panel itself. But if you don't have the architectural space, once these projects are built out, then they specifically cited some parking structures on the challenge that they would incur if they had to provide a space for the additional room. So I think we definitely need to consider the importance of that in the language.
Yeah, thank you, Brad. And that I apologize we didn't make that clear. That is absolutely the intent behind the EV capable space, would be to require that future electrical closet have physical space for that. Adam, and then Chris.
Thanks. Yeah, I mean, I think that, Brad, to your question, I think as Kim was saying, the goal really is to try to get feedback enough that we can draft the language. And then so I think there will be an attempt to put language to that definition. And then as you all have the opportunity to review it, make sure it actually says what we meant it to say. What I was going to weigh in on was really just weighing in towards that really high end 30. I would advocate for 40% EVCL. I think we really are, I think Tim made the good point about, this is really trying to offset the need for major structural changes, which, as I think Brad just noted too, that there are a lot of concerns about, you can upsize panels, you can add wiring, but a lot of the major infrastructure changes are going to come from that, tearing up of a parking lot or having to, reconfigure an electrical room to accommodate the additional capacity for that equipment. So I think that, when we're considering a light option, I think, certainly we would have advocated for even higher on some of the baser options as well. But I mean, I think that we feel that this is a very good compromise in helping to offset some of those major infrastructure costs that would come and be the most difficult to do in a retrofit later.
Thank you, Adam. I'll go to Chris.
Hi, thanks. Yeah, I just wanted to advocate for 30% as a floor. Basically for the reasons Adam was just sharing, don't need to repeat them. They've been discussed extensively, but just the very significant cost savings. I also think our votes so far, bears that out and supports. So it's good to see that in kind of the initial survey report out. And then also just wanted to support Brad's point on making sure electrical rooms have enough space and capacity.
Yeah, great. Thank you, Chris. I'll go to Aaron.
Yeah, and I apologize. I just had to step away for a minute, so maybe this was covered. But is there a defined? Is EVCL firmly defined, or is that something yet to be firmly defined? I know we've talked about just conduit, no space and panel, but is there a definition that's written that's what we're voting on?
Good question, Aaron. There is no definition. The components of the definition are, as was stated, conduit and physical space. We will be working with our technical advisor to basically draft the language around defining this, and this would be added to the definitions within the code language. Kim.
I just wanted to reemphasize Chris's comment earlier that he noted that there was quite a bit of support for a high amount of requirements for EV ready for multifamily. Quite a few of those comments were requesting 50% or more, which based on the previous slide, kind of this EVCL is our way to potentially address those public comments as well. In addition to making sure that our multifamily housing stock is ready and doesn't have to go through extensive retrofits in the near future as EVs increase. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Kim. Okay. Any other thoughts on this breakdown allocation for EV capable light? Okay. Hearing none, at least for now. I think what I'm hearing pretty strongly that between 20 and 30% is where we should fall. And I heard a lot more, I guess, more advocacy for the 30% threshold, which would bring the total number of parking spaces under EV readiness requirement up to 60%. So between EV capable, EV installed, EV ready, EV capable light, we'd be looking at 60% breakdown. Andrew.
If we previously took a straw poll on a different topic, would that be more correct in this topic, or is a general concurrence adequate?
I think so, and apologies that we're kind of taking different tacks with these different options here. That the one that we straw polled was a pretty simple question. And so I felt a little bit more comfortable straw polling that. I'm happy if you guys would like to do a straw poll between maybe 20 and 30% EV capable light. I'm happy to accommodate for that. And I'm seeing a couple nods. So maybe then we move forward with that as our straw poll here. So option 1 for the straw poll will be 20% of the total spaces will be EV capable light. Ron, did you have a thought?
No.
Okay. And then option 2 for the straw poll will be 30% EV capable light. Okay. So please only vote for one option. Please raise your hand if you would like to see 20% EV capable light spaces. Give everyone keep your hands up. I just want to make sure everyone has a moment to throw theirs up. Okay, all hands up that we want. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 for option 1. Okay, option 2 is 30% EV capable light. Please raise your hands if this is your preference. 12. Okay, so I've got 12 votes for option 2. Okay, awesome. So then with that in mind, we will move forward with the 30% EV capable light spaces for our draft code language package. Thank you, Adam, or excuse me, thank you, Andrew, for that suggestion. I appreciate that. All right, so we are not done with EV ready yet. The next topic we've got is EV ready for residential. Oh, actually, I lied. We're not even done with the commercial multifamily yet. So the last question we had for you guys on commercial and multifamily for the EV ready spaces is what additional provisions you guys wanted to include. And these are the list of the additional provisions that we reviewed with you guys at the end of the last meeting. And I know we flew through them pretty quick. So within the survey, we linked the slides. So hopefully you guys were able to take a look at those slides as a reference point. So we've highlighted in green where the highest percentage of voters their votes fell for each one of these elements. So the first one, raceway size, 47% of the board voted to include this as a requirement. Interestingly enough, when it came to the residential questions, we did not get a majority of the board voting for specifying the raceway size. So I'm not sure if anyone wants to speak to why they voted for it in commercial over residential, but just a note there. We saw strong support for including the EV readiness infrastructure and labeling on construction documents, for identification of the equipment and signage on the physical site within the electric panel and all of that good stuff. We did see a strong support for accessibility requirements, and then some, I guess, half support for including safety requirements. So, making sure that the charging station itself doesn't cause a trip hazard or isn't at risk of being meddled with or damaged by vehicles. And then there were 2 requirements that came through. The majority voted to keep them as a recommendation within the code language, and that was disbursement and public access to the spaces, which Tim, you brought up earlier, and then the service fees and limitations of charging space. That piece is really related to not prohibiting parking lot owners from charging for the power that the EV chargers give. So any thoughts on where these fell? Carolyn, I'll start with you and then we'll go to Tim.
Yeah, I think I was the include as recommendation rather than defining it in energy code, just because I'm a little bit like on the accessibility portion, I'm concerned with getting cross-eyed with other code requirements, and I think we'd have to do a little bit of check for consistency and where we might create conflict. It's not something we've explicitly explored as a team yet. And then on the service fees, limitation of charging space use, there's such a diversity into different arrangements of businesses, like how businesses are arranged, whether they want to offer it for employees or public. I just didn't feel like that was a space we should get into as a code board for setting a minimum state standard. I'm very comfortable offering some recommendations and best practices, but I'm a little uncomfortable trying to constrain how businesses can recover their costs of the infrastructure and charging. And I think we haven't done any analysis on this. I'm happy to take it up like in the future code as we do more research, but I just don't think we've done it here to really think about that. So that's why I advocated for that. I will note on the safety and protections, this is another area, and I would look to our CBOs to comment on this more and maybe help clarify. But because you're installing electrical hardware, I think there's also requirements that fall in the NEC. And so again, it's that, what do we put in the energy code versus what is addressed elsewhere piece that I don't have a good clarity on, but that's the other piece I would flag. So that's why I voted my way.
Thank you, Carolyn. Tim.
Yeah, thank you. So I guess I have a question for the board members who voted on the disbursement public access, the 58% that voted that way as a recommendation, as to maybe why they chose that instead of making it a requirement. And coming from an enforcement standpoint as a building official, I'd much prefer, and I'm going to speak for developers, even though I'm not a developer, but I deal with developers a lot, in that if there's a requirement and it tells you pretty much how to do it or what the disbursement should be throughout the different jurisdictions that they build, I think it really helps the building community to comply with an ordinance or such as we're developing here, instead of leaving it up to the local building official and plan reviewer to decide what that should be. And I've had that, with building codes getting adopted. We're home rule city or home rule state, and all the amendments get piled on and change things. But I'm just curious to get some feedback of why 58% thought it should just be a recommendation, which means it's not enforceable.
Thanks, Tim. That's a good question. Andrew, I don't know if you have an answer, but I'll pass it to you. And then if anyone wants to jump in to answer Tim's question.
Tim, Andrew, this question, from what I said, was a question. Is it more of a code question or is it more of a regulatory question for a different body? And that, I think, as the question was posed, wasn't clear to me. Should it be addressed in an alternate context, or should it be addressed in a building code? So from where I sit, I appreciate kind of your perspective on the clarity that some people prefer tell me what to do and I'll do it. If you give me a choice, sometimes you don't know what it'll be. And I may say that that may be a home rule question, not necessarily a developer question. But from where I sat, I was unclear as to who else could answer that question or who else should answer that question.
Thanks, Andrew. Kevin?
Yeah, and my response is actually to Tim's initial question there, and it really has to do with some of the complexities we see in larger multifamily or mixed-use projects where the division of parking gets really complicated in terms of different uses. So if you have a shared podium project with office, hotel, and residential on it, that was my only reason for saying that as a recommendation, so that the requirement didn't create something that could completely foul up the ability to do a condo map to separate that parking structure out after the fact.
Thanks, Kevin. Yeah, Elizabeth?
I was just going to echo that. I was one of the, I think I either said include as a recommendation or don't include. I'm not sure I actually voted for any of the include as a recommendation because I think we're writing codes here, not recommendations. And that's not traditionally part of what should be included in a code, that it either needs to be in the code as written, thou shalt, or not. But yeah, just I'll echo what Kevin said, that parking is complicated and it's, I think that would personally be an enforcement nightmare if you had a mixed use kind of project or even a design nightmare, which is very difficult to figure out. So my feeling was leave it in the hands of the folks who can best figure out what's going to work for that particular project.
Thanks, Elizabeth. Adam?
I'm not necessarily weighing in on any of these particular ones. I wanted to more address what Elizabeth was saying about codes typically saying, one definitively one way or the other. I think the way we were thinking about this is essentially almost including these as like the equivalent of appendices, where a jurisdiction could choose to adopt the requirement or not, but not necessarily including it in the base code. So not saying like, oh, well, you could do this or you don't have to. It's saying like, here's all the things you have to do. add potentially appendices that jurisdictions could choose to adopt in addition to the requirements, but not necessarily have to do that.
Then if I didn't vote for do not include, I would vote for do not include.
Thanks, Elizabeth. Ron, and then I'll go to Tim.
Yeah, I was just going to echo some of the comments that have been previously mentioned. When you look at parking, and especially if there's multiple kinds of business uses and residential uses of a shared parking lot, both the disbursement and the fees start to get really, really complicated, which is why I suggested them as recommendations rather than requirements. If it was single purpose parking lots in both cases, I think I probably would have put them in as requirements. But I think once you start sharing it, it starts to get really complicated, especially if businesses change over time and ownership changes. It just seems like you get to a place where it's just really hard to figure out what the answer is.
Thanks, Ron. Okay. Tim, hopefully that answers your question a bit on why folks voted the way they did. Okay, does anybody else want to comment on the way they voted or include sort of a justification for how they voted when it comes to these additional elements? Okay. So based on the survey results, again, our team is going to take our best possible crack at writing the recommendations based on some of the feedback we got. Mo, I saw your hand pop in and then pop back out. Did you have a thought?
Yeah, sorry. I thought Carolyn had a question for the building officials about the NEC. Did that get answered?
Oh, thanks, Mo, for flagging that.
No worries.
I don't believe it did. Do any of our building code officials, I think Carolyn was asking, does the NEC cover safety sort of protocols that we would be talking about as a separate requirement here? Yeah, Tim.
Not that I'm aware of. I think a lot of that might be coming from the OSHA side of things, which are federal guidelines. I'm not an electrical code expert, an NEC expert, but it's my experience. I don't think that that's really dealt with. I know protection from vehicles. They do have some code language that you would need, say, pipe bollers in front of, say, like electrical panel boards and whatnot. Trip hazards, that's not a requirement in any code. One could think that there's a trip hazard requirement in the International Building Code or the IRC, but it doesn't even talk about that.
Thanks, Tim. Yeah, Ron, do you want to weigh in?
Yeah, I think there is, I think, of a little bit in the NEC related to the electric vehicle service equipment itself and the length of cord and additional supports for the cords. But that's the only piece of it that I can think of. So there is a little bit in there for the equipment, installed equipment, that might help.
Great, thank you guys. Okay, so as I was saying, we will take our best crack at drafting the code language, and then when we present that to you guys for review, know that again, when we get to the meeting where we're voting, we'll have that opportunity for you guys to weigh in on changes that you'd like to make to the code language package that we produce. So we'll leave this one here for now, and we'll continue on to, and I'll skip through. I had a couple slides for examples. Residential EV ready code. So I recognize we didn't get a chance to dive into residential EV ready codes at our last meeting. And the key decisions that our board here needs to make for residential EV codes are whether or not we want one EV ready or one EV capable space for residential buildings. And to state this so we don't get confused, this is just for 1 to 2 family dwellings, townhomes, duplexes. Multifamily, we just discussed. So keep that, just make sure to keep that distinction. Within the residential EV code language, we will be running with the exact same definitions for EV capable, EV ready, EV installed. So just a reminder, our definition for EV capable is the space has to have the electric panel capacity and conduit for future EV charging, and it has to the panel capacity has to be a minimum of 208 volts with a 40 amp rated circuit. Where that differs between EV ready, and I know we've covered this, but just to reemphasize that EV ready spaces also include raceway wiring, receptacle, and circuit overprotection devices for the future EV charging. Otherwise, the rest of those requirements stay the same. So when we asked the board how this should fall, it was a slight majority leaning towards one EV ready space, with, I mean, a pretty high vote count still for EV capable space. And so we'll just pause here, since this is really one of the biggest decisions, if not the biggest decision we need to make for residential EV codes. And let's see if we can't get some discussion on where you guys think this should land. Carolyn, and then Adam.
Yeah, so I will offer, I think, I definitely advocate for this to be an EV ready space. We're literally talking about a dedicated circuit in a garage. And the incremental cost of doing that is negligible, and we're not stranding investment. I mean, people can do something other than charging their EV with that outlet. And so that's why I think it needs to be EV ready.
Thank you, Carolyn. Adam?
I would echo everything Carolyn just said, and would just kind of revisit my earlier comments about EV charging and the importance of having that where people live, and the ease of future EV charging and installation of the technology to charge.
Thank you, Adam. Chris?
Just ditto Carolyn and Adam. Strong preference for EV ready.
And Ron? Thanks, Chris.
I agree as well. We've in Boulder County, we've been requiring EV ready for a while. It's worked great, although we have added an exception to the code to accommodate people who have detached garages that don't have electric power service.
Okay, yeah, thank you, Ron. Tim?
Yeah, thank you. When Broomfield did their EV ordinance, this was last year when Judy Hammer took it through council and got approved. She had requested to get some feedback from my staff from permit submittals from and issuances from solar companies. I'm sorry, from EV companies such as Tesla. And the feedback we got from a few different bigger companies that did those permits were they preferred not to have, or didn't even need to have, the receptacle in place. And so we modified that language just to provide that junction box with the wiring to that that single spot in the garage, because these companies had their own systems that they would just remove those receptacles and hardwire in their product. So that was just from Broomfield standpoint. I'm not going to advocate one way or another for the state, but that's how we ended up writing our ordinance that's in place right now.
Yeah, thanks, Tim, for sharing that. Elizabeth?
Yeah, I'm pretty sure I voted for EV ready as well, because we also want to make sure that we are inclusive of the folks who don't own the homes. So, rentals, townhomes, anything that fits within the residential code where people do not have the ability to necessarily make modifications themselves and are really kind of beholden to whatever's there. And whatever's there is probably going to be there forever. So EV ready can be accommodated to charge pretty much every electric vehicle with or without a charger.
Thanks, Elizabeth. Yeah, Kristen.
I concur. And, in a former career, I spent a lot of time looking at the breakdown of rental properties versus owner-occupied properties and investments in things like solar efficiency, EV upgrades. And I think from a justice perspective, especially looking at the types of communities that do tend to rent, if you don't require EV ready, it's going to be very much harder for those people to access what they need to plug in cars.
Yeah, thank you, Kristen. Andrew.
Yes, Andrew Harris. I've discussed this with several of the manufacturers, and consistent with what Tim had expressed, I've found more of them in the same manner that the discussion with the conduit for solar has been responded to by some of the manufacturers, that it can sometimes be a nuisance for them when too much is installed for them, that they may not use it, and it may be an impediment to their efforts. And it gets to be tough on how far does one go here, that the simplicity of the capability sometimes is more advantageous to the future.
Yeah, thank you, Andrew. Okay, so I'm hearing advocates on both sides of the equation here. So I know that this question in and of itself was kind of a straw poll, but just in case anyone was swayed one way or the other based on the feedback folks have provided, maybe we can do another one here. And first, I'll make sure everyone has a chance to speak. And Tim, I'd love to move to you next.
Oops, I just had a question. So we would not be able to change the definition in the ordinance, correct? Like the EV ready ordinance, which has that word receptacle, we could not modify that language.
That is correct.
Thank you.
Kevin?
I will say, just in terms of minor language questions like that, I did have a chance to discuss this with Senator Hansen, who's one of the co-sponsors of the bill. And he indicated that if we had, language amendments like that, that they actually fairly readily could be revised. So it wasn't a, have at it, but if we come across a real stumbling block for ourselves, he indicated that that was probably fairly readily added to an amendment in this session.
Thank you, Kevin. Adam, you want to respond to that?
Yeah, I mean, I would just note our time. I mean, we're pushing up against April 1st deadline pretty close, pretty quickly here. And while I appreciate that, Kevin, and I appreciate Senator Hansen's willingness to work with us on that, I also am very well aware of the legislative process and how slow that is. And I would be very shocked if that was able to get passed before April 1st. So while that, if that was a possibility and we could pursue that, I would certainly not, encourage anyone to count on that as the solution.
Well said, Adam. Thank you.
Thank you, Adam. Okay, does anyone else want to give their final thoughts or advocate for one version of this or another before we go ahead and straw poll? Okay, I'm not seeing any hands. So for this straw poll, we will have option 1 as the EV capable space. Option 2 will be EV ready space. And I see you type in, so thanks already for putting it in the chat. So once we get that in the chat, we will go ahead and post our vote. So option 1, EV capable, please raise your hand if this is the route that you would like to take the residential requirement. Okay. All right. Thank you, guys. 3 votes for EV capable. And then raise your hands if you would like to have this be an EV ready space. All right. 1, 2, 3, 4, 12. That is 16 for EV ready. Okay. Thank you, everyone. Great. So we will move forward drafting the code language with an EV ready space as the minimum requirement. Do you have a question or thought? Where's your hand? Just still up.
Still up. Sorry.
Okay, no worries. Just want to make sure.
You're still muted, Kim.
Thank you. So we did ask about a couple of additional provisions and whether or not we wanted to include language around these for the residential requirements. So the majority of folks said not to include language around raceway size. And then we saw similar results for just including some note in the code language that you have to show the branch circuit and all of the electrical components on the construction drawings, as well as identify in the panel on site that those spaces are for future, or that the panel capacity is for future EV charging. Any thoughts, or anyone want to share any ideas here before we move on? Yeah, Carolyn.
Yeah, no, I made this note to you, Kim, is I think if you're actually installing the receptacle in the location, then I think the raceway sizing is not relevant. And I also think it would already have to be within the construction documentation, and technically would also have to be ID'd at the service panel. So I think I don't have strong feelings about saying we require it. I'm just noting that it probably already is if we move forward with the EV ready requirement.
Yeah, thanks for bringing that up again, Carolyn. I appreciated that thought, and that didn't cross our minds when we wrote this. So I appreciated you bringing that up. Tim, do you want to go to you next?
Yeah, thank you. I don't think it needs to be in there because every jurisdiction is enforcing a national electrical code, and that has requirements for raceway based on the amount of conductors that go in. So that would be redundant electrical code or rule.
Thanks, Tim. That's super helpful. Elizabeth, and then Ron.
Yeah, I'll just echo that. I voted do not include because that's already covered within the scope of the NEC.
That's why we're grateful for experts like you on this board. Thank you, guys. Ron?
Yeah, I definitely agree that all of these things are already going to be covered by the existing electrical code, but I could see some additional advantages of some additional signage that's really targeting the occupants so they understand what that receptacle is and what it might be used for. It seems to me that a lot of folks, especially renters, may not ever open up the electric panel, look inside and understand what they're looking at. But it would be useful for them to know that, in fact, if they just bought a plug-in charger, they can plug it into that receptacle and they're good to go.
Yeah, thanks, Ron. We can see if there's any language like that out there. And if you know of any, would be happy to take a look at that. Zach?
I was going to say the same thing also. The authority having jurisdiction is under the NEC, so under the National Electrical Code. So
Awesome. Yeah, thank you, Zach. Okay, so it sounds like a lot of these are taken care of, and we can take a look at if within the ID of equipment and signage requirements, if there's a labeling that can happen on the outlet as well to let renters or future renters know about that outlet. Okie dokie. So there is one other piece that we wanted to talk with you guys about as far as residential requirements. And this has come up in a couple of the code languages that the code language packages that we've looked at from communities across the state. And this is exceptions to the residential EV ready rule. And so these are the two exceptions that we've seen, and just wanted to make sure we vetted these with you guys to see if there's interest in including exceptions. And Ron, you also mentioned another one that you guys have at Boulder County that I think we might have missed here, but that detached garages without electric service are also exempt. So exemptions, those two words are getting mixed up in my mind. Exceptions that Dillon, Frisco, Lafayette, and Superior have in place is that an EV ready space is not required where there are no parking spaces required. So I don't know if that's obvious or not, but making that statement very, very clear. And then for Dillon and Frisco, they also have an exception for parking spaces that are used exclusively for trucks or for delivery vehicles. That seems to be more in the context of a multifamily building. But just wanted to see if there are any thoughts for exceptions. We can also include the one that Ron shared for consideration. Yeah, Adam.
I think, my feeling about the first exception displayed here, it kind of brings me back to the solar ready conversation we had, where it's like, you know, do we need to actively say that if your building doesn't have a roof that is capable of solar ready, do you need to say that you don't have to have a solar ready zone? Same kind of thought process here of if your building, if you have 0 parking spaces, then do we need to say that you don't have to have EV charging infrastructure in the non-existent parking spaces? So it just seems a little bit unnecessary to me in terms of that. I would like to think that that's common sense, but perhaps I'm mistaken on that.
Yeah, thanks, Adam. Tim?
Yeah, thanks. I concur with Adam's comment right there. But just generally speaking, if we could just back up just a moment. So these two are exceptions we're just now starting to talk about potentially would be for residential or multifamily, single family, and commercial overall, or just on the commercial side?
Yeah, no, I'm sorry. Thanks, Tim, for asking the clarifying question. This is just for residential 1 to 2 family dwellings, townhomes, duplexes. So not including multifamily.
Okay, thank you. And that would lead me to believe or make the comment is I don't think you need to write those exceptions in. Because typically on a single family or 1 and 2 family or even townhome project, they're not requiring outdoor parking spaces. Sometimes they require like to have enough parking for 2 vehicles, whether it's on the driveway or in a 2-car garage or something like that. But I've rarely seen on like a single family development that any outside parking is like on street parking is required.
Okay. Thanks, Tim. Okay. Any other thoughts on this piece? It sounds like generally speaking, we don't necessarily need these exceptions because it's kind of built into the code language itself. If you don't have a parking space assigned to your duplex or townhome or single family home, there is no parking to make EV ready. Okay. Awesome. Well, again, we are going to take our best crack at developing all of this code language. We're really excited to get you guys a code language package to review early next week. And we'll look forward to your very thoughtful and technical reviews at that time. And if you guys have any major flags, we'll look forward to seeing those then. But for now, that wraps up our EV ready discussions. So nice work, everybody, getting through all of that. It's a lot to cover. And so now I'm going to pass it over to Allie, who will lead us through our electric, the kickstart to our electric ready discussions.
Oh, thanks, Kim. So first we are going to cover probably just residential at this point in the day, electric ready. So first we'll go over what the statute says and then dive into some code language after that. Kim, if you could advance the slides. The statute language says that we have to develop language for electric ready requirements for single family residential mixed fuel use buildings, as well as multifamily and small commercial mixed fuel buildings under 10,000 square feet. And what mixed fuel use buildings are, yes, okay, so electric ready by the statute includes adequate panel capacity, dedicated electrical panel space, electrical wire, electrical receptacles, and adequate physical space to accommodate the future installation of high efficiency electric appliances, which includes heating, water heating, cooking, drying, and electric vehicles. And then the mixed fuel use component means a residential or commercial building that is designed and built with equipment that uses gaseous fuels on site in addition to electricity. And so what all of that means is that the key decisions that we have to make to fulfill the statute next slide, are for these single family residences that have gas and electricity. And then also for multifamily and small commercial buildings, which means under 10,000 square feet, that also have the gas and electricity components. Everything else, again, is up to your discretion. And so in practice, what that means for the residential electric ready code is, you could go to the next slide. This means that we are accommodating the specific functions inside of a house, specifically heating, water heating, cooking, drying, and electric vehicle charging, by providing these 5 key elements: adequate panel capacity, dedicated electrical panel space, electric wire, electrical receptacles, and adequate physical space. So for now, we are just covering residential single-family mixed-use field buildings. So that means what's required by statute. The decisions that we'll have to make are on the specifics of electrical circuit and panel sizing, as well as location or adjacency of the receptacle. And so we're going to review some code language that jurisdictions across the state have adopted. And when we sort of went through all of that language, we saw a range in specificity that folks required. And so it kind of ranges from the very specific, with basalt kind of requiring like minimum voltage and amperage, and then being very specific about where the circuits are located, the circuit breaker space that must be reserved, etc. And then Denver kind of striking that middle ground of specifying a 2-pole circuit breaker, and then just saying like, oh, some of this other equipment has to be sized to accommodate the load without giving like that specific minimum. And then it kind of goes to the very open-ended, which is exemplified by Louisville, where the dedicated circuit shall have a minimum amperage requirement. So just giving that very general sense of adequate capacity, minimum amperage, without getting into like the actual numbers. So first, tackling electrical capacity. The main question that we saw kind of rise out of reviewing all of this language was whether the panel should have space for a single pole circuit breaker or dual pole, or just kind of give that general reserved space language. And if you want to go into the specifics, what specific voltage or amperage or conductor types. So we have crested butte and basalt here that kind of give this specific guidance, which is where a gas heating or water heating is installed, provide a dedicated electric circuit, panel space, and location for condensate drainage. So that's sort of the general end of the spectrum. And then, as we said before, basalt has language requiring for water heater, clothes dryers, stove, and HVAC system pre-wiring with adequate panel capacity, and then a dedicated minimum 125 volts, 20 amp electrical receptacle connected to the electrical panel with a 120 or 240 volt 3 conductor 10 AWG copper branch circuit shall be provided within 3 feet from each of the gas or propane water heater, et cetera, accessible with no obstructions. And a single pole circuit breaker space must be reserved in the electrical panel adjacent to each circuit breaker for the branch circuit and labeled with the words future 240 volt use. So that really captures kind of the spectrum of general and very specific. And then next slide, we have Denver and Erie, which have very similar language. Erie has a few subtle differences, but most of the key elements are the same. And that specifies that the fossil fuel appliances and equipment shall be provided with a junction box or receptacle located within 12 inches or foot of the gas appliance, equipment or end use that is connected to an electrical panel by continuous raceways or conductors that meets the following requirements. The junction box, raceway, and bus bar in the electric panel and conductors serving the electrical panel shall be sized to accommodate electric water heating equipment, which is sized to serve the same load as the fossil fuel appliance or equipment. The panel shall be have reserved physical space for a 2-pole circuit breaker. And the junction box and electrical panel directory entry for the dedicated circuit breaker space shall have labels stating for future electric equipment. So that's kind of striking that middle ground of having some requirements be very specific and leaving it a little bit more vague depending on the load that the fossil fuel appliances are imposing. And then one last one on electrical capacity. Louisville and Superior have the more open-ended version of this, which is combustion equipment shall be provided with a dedicated circuit that shall have a minimum amperage requirement for a comparable electric appliance, equipment, or end use, an electrical receptacle or junction box that is connected to the electrical panel, and conductors of adequate capacity within 6 feet of the appliance or equipment. Each such circuit shall be accessible with no obstructions. Both ends of the unused conductor or conduit shall be labeled for future electric equipment and be electrically isolated. And so before we move on, I wanted to make sure that the board had some space to think about sort of how specific folks wanted to get with the code. And if you had thoughts about what specifics we should be including in our draft language. Yeah, Caroline.
Question, can you remind me, a couple of them had proximity to the appliance. Was there variability in that?
Yeah, that's I think on the next slide, but we saw a range from like 1 foot, 3 feet, and then 6 feet was the max.
Okay, thank you. And another question. When I was reading one of these, it occurred to me, I think the consistent intent is that there be space in the panel for a circuit breaker for each appliance, correct?
I think so, yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, Kristen.
I just want to throw out an opinion there that I actually like the specificity around having 2 poles, because in my opinion, you can't be all electric if you can't supply 240.
Thank you. Anyone else have a sense of how specific we want to be? Do you want to go to the slide 50 where they have the range, Kim?
Is this the one you were looking for?
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, Adam.
My initial reaction, and I will be the first to admit that I'm by no means an expert on some of the specifics of this, is that having kind of more that general language, or at least the language included, that it should be sized to accommodate equivalent systems. I think that seems really key to me, because it seems to me that like the panel needs and the capacity needs are going to be very different from a single family home that's 1,000 square feet versus a single family home that's 11,000 square feet. And we see those big homes up on the hills in the mountains that are huge. And I would imagine that they're going to have different needs, but that they're going to have, whatever the existing gas infrastructure that's there, that it will be easier to accommodate whatever the alternative, electric requirements would be to offset those gas systems. So that was my initial reaction, but I'd honestly be curious to hear a little bit more from our, Kevin or Elizabeth, or, the architect side, designer side of that, and how that would play out given the wide range of possibilities and different home sizes and thus different capacity needs.
Thank you, Adam. Carolyn and then Tim.
Yeah, I was going to ask kind of a similar question because I think we should be cautious about specifying a minimum amperage if we haven't verified that all of the appliances in question that would be their amperage. And I think they may be different. Like I think like an induction stove may have a higher amperage requirement, but I'm not 100% sure. So I just wanted, like, if we go there, I agree with Kristen's comment about a 2-pole, and making sure that that's where we're going. But the balance of it, I don't have enough information to make a decision on.
Thanks. Tim?
Yeah, thank you. That was a great point. Carolyn, I agree with that. And I am a building code geek from a long time, but not an electrical code geek. So I'll be the first to admit, I think Adam said it too. But with that being said, I think it would be really helpful to get like maybe a peer review or third party separate kind of opinion from an electrical engineer. I don't think we have any, I'm not sure. I don't think we have any on the board, but to try to assess what would be best to allow the most flexibility. So, but that idea just popped up after Carolyn. My real reason I raised my hand was how do we deal, or how does this deal with gas fireplaces? Because we get them in most houses. I think Adam talked about the big house up on the hill, and some of the big houses we get in Broomfield. They might have 4 or 5 of those. So I would assume, and I hate using that word, that in some of these ordinances, Louisville or Superior, that they'd be requiring an electrical raceway and electrical outlet adjacent to the gas fireplace. I mean, anywhere where you got a gas line, I would assume that the intent of this would be that you're providing that potential to change that out. Would that be a correct statement?
Kim, can you scroll up to the definition of electric ready just to see exactly what it says? I think that would be helpful in this context. One more down. There we go.
Yeah, I was going to say, I don't think anybody's addressed the gas fireplace or the outdoor grill, but only the space and water heating and cooking and drying.
I mean, maybe this is a question for David, and maybe we'd have to take this offline and read into this more clearly. But I mean, the definition says including heating, water heating. So that doesn't necessarily mean that other things couldn't be included. But in my read, that means that those 4 things plus the EV are what's required for electric readiness. And then anything beyond that is optional. But we might want to talk with David about that offline and get back to you guys before.
I think we can talk about it right now if you like, Adam. I agree.
Yeah, please do.
I agree with you. When someone says including, it's generally not a complete list.
But David, would you agree with my thought that it means that you have to do the things that are listed, but you could do other things that are not listed?
Correct. Yes.
Okay.
That's really helpful. Thank you.
One clarifying question might be whether those gas fireplaces are ambiance or, an integral part of the home's heating system. I could see flexibility where if they're ambiance, but not part of the, dedicated home heating system, not necessarily requiring ability to convert and, something for optional ambiance to electric, but I could also see other opinions.
Yeah, thank you. I'll go Brad, then Tim, then Rob. Thanks.
Thanks, Allie. Yeah, just to Kristen's point, I immediately thought when she said that, what about just changing the definition ever so slightly to just primary space heating? Yeah. If it's labeled as primary, maybe then you eliminate a fireplace.
Yeah.
Brad, to that point, I don't know that we have the ability to modify this definition because it came from state statute.
Let me just chime in again and agree with you, Allie.
Cool. Yeah, Tim, go for it.
My answer is I've been doing this, looking at homes with gas fireplaces for about 32 years now, and I don't recall ever seeing a gas fireplace put in for primary heat. That doesn't mean that it could happen or be designed that way. But I haven't seen it between Boulder County, Louisville, and here. So that's just from my perspective.
Rob?
Yeah, I suppose it's immaterial at this point in time, but I'm a little concerned with the definition of electric ready, insofar as a home that's just built to code, I don't think is electric ready. I just did some napkin calculations, so take them for what they were, but a home with a 60,000 BTU heat load would require 17 kilowatts of peak panel of peak electric load for equivalent. That's 71 amps. That's a lot of power, assuming that it's a 240 volt connection. And so when we start talking about adequate panel capacity, those numbers are going to start climbing really, really fast when we start slipping into houses like 60,000 BTU is not an unusual house. In fact, I think it's probably a pretty good house based on what we see, based on the heating capacity that's in our Beyond Code program. So I just want to make sure. I mean, it feels like it's beyond the scope here, but I know within the jurisdictional breakout, there's kind of one passing reference, anything related to energy efficiency, and that's Fort Collins, and it's usage per it's kBTU per square foot. Everything else is just equipment swaps, and that really makes me uncomfortable because it's going to make it really expensive once these houses cut over to operate them, especially in peak environments.
Thanks, Rob. That's really helpful context. I'll go to Ron, then Carolyn.
Yeah, I would say we have had situations where we've had to figure out if a fireplace is considered decorative or is contributing to the heat of the house. And we really just looked at what the other systems in the house were and whether or not they were sized based upon essentially the manual J calculation or information we got from another energy model to figure out if that was in fact supplying a significant portion of space heating for the home. And there were sometimes when that was the case. They might have some mini splits feeding the bedrooms, but the main living space might be fed with a gas fireplace. The place where it got really kind of squirrely was when you had those fireplaces that were through the walls, so they were part of the building envelope, and so they were visible from both inside and outside, and that got fairly challenging. And I would say the other place where we haven't really talked about it all is gas-fired appliances that are outside the building envelope. So we definitely see fully decorative gas fireplaces outside, not to mention a variety of other exterior heating devices on the outside of the home.
Thank you, Ron. Carolyn, and then Kristen.
Yeah, and I had one thing I just wanted to name is I'm not quite sure what we require as electric ready where it's a hydronic system. And if we found any specific examples that address that in terms of what's assumed to be the replacement of that, the electric replacement of that, and how that would inform what we need to specify.
That's interesting. Yeah, Kristen.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask Rob, were you just doing that conversion straight from BTU to electric watts, assuming electric resistance? Because you're going to have a lot lower draw on a heat pump.
Yes, but during peak heating events, it's going to be resistance heat. I
don't know. I beg to differ.
We have to, no. It's a peak event. It's not an incidental event. A peak event of, a 10% of hours per year, you're going to be running on resistance heat. The system's not going to be designed for 100% hours. It's going to be designed for 95 or 99% hours.
Sure it is. But I can tell you, and I pay attention to peak quite closely, given that our utility pays 200 times more for peak electricity draw than we do for electricity other times. And I think there are plenty of instances where you can have a heat pump that's not necessarily going to be hitting that peak, or at least not coincident with everybody else, but we could take that offline.
Especially when you have building envelopes that are designed to coast a bit. All of a sudden, you really don't need to be running that appliance when your temperatures are at those peaks.
Yeah, and we have really bad electric resistance.
Building envelopes is not a part of this discussion. This is about being EV ready. And I think 2021 is a good envelope, but there's ways to get around building to the 2021 prescriptive expectations, all the way back to 2009 envelopes. So
I'll just add, your biggest heating loads are not skim loads, they're ventilation and infiltration.
Given that point taken, and I wonder if we should inject some conversation here about new electrical panels that are coming out that have the ability to balance loads. So for example, like the span panel, which 200 amps, but it lets you prioritize. If we are hitting a peak, you can turn off one appliance and switch electricity to the other one. One thing to consider there. Do you want to include flexibility for new types of technology that are coming out, or include a requirement that we have these huge panel capacity sizes? I'd argue for more flexibility.
Thanks, Kristen. Go to Tom next.
I'd like to echo Rob's concerns about the electric resistance backups on the heat pumps. Because even if we're talking about design hours in a year, and typically they wouldn't be used, you're really designing everything around an event. And can we say in a 10-year or a 15-year period that there's not going to be some event that will require all of these electric backups turning on, coincident with the utility? I don't think we can say that.
Kim, you want to jump in?
Yeah, I just want to remind everybody of our charge here. We for better or for worse, need to put in place electric ready requirements for single family homes. And so, well, I think it's very, I don't want to say what we're talking about is not important and relevant, but I think the question at hand is, how do we make sure these homes are going to be as cost effective and electrifying in the future? And we have to focus on, per state statute, let me get there. Heating, water heating, cooking, and drying. And so this is the scope of what we need to accomplish. And so I'd ask that we just try to stay focused on at least thinking through how we want these requirements to look. Whether your opinions on all electric are good or bad, or wherever you fall on the spectrum, we are not here to debate that. So I just wanted to reorient us to make sure that we're really focused on the question at hand. And that is all. Thank you.
Well, thanks, Kim. Yeah, we'll go to Don next.
So just to kind of key on what Kim's talking here a little bit, we get taken off on a few side conversations, but I think an open definition is going to serve everybody the best. You've got a lot of differences in this state, from Boulder County to Baca County, big differences. And I think the key here is going to be keeping that definition open and letting these jurisdictions make any other necessary restrictions on them that they need.
Thanks, Don. Kim? Other Kim.
I just wanted to ask if the language of adequate panel capacity and dedicated electrical panel space, if that encompassed Kristen's suggestion related to the alternative and improved electrical boxes. I really like that suggestion that we at least make sure that those are covered as options in here. So I just wanted to ask that question from a technical standpoint.
Adam, you want to jump in here?
Yeah, I mean, I think all that the state statute says is that there has to be panel capacity and panel space. So I don't think that the statute would, or any code that is being adopted, unless you put a restriction on it saying, these new panels are not cannot be used to meet those requirements. I would read that as to, being inclusive of any panel that can get you to those requirements.
That's really helpful. Rob, did you have something to add?
Yeah, I do. And I mean, I really don't want to come in here and sound seriously like a real, like a laggard or a Debbie Downer on this, but again, we're like, I think smart panels have a future, and I think that the advanced heat pumps that can continue to provide heat down to minus 15 or minus 20 or minus 30 degrees absolutely have a place in the future. But we're setting a standard for the entire state, and we need to keep that in mind too. That those are things that jurisdictionally might make sense, but we have to consider whether they make sense for the entire state.
And Rob, I hope you don't mind if I jump in here. Do you have, I guess, just by way of the question posed, where does your thinking fall as far as like how specific should we be in requiring the different electric infrastructure?
Sorry. Probably in the middle or right, definitely not very specific, because I think it's too prescriptive at that point in time.
I'd argue for the middle too.
Maybe this is another fun opportunity for a straw poll.
Yeah, absolutely. We can do that. I guess I want to make sure that if there are any other thoughts, because we've gone on a couple of little side paths, if any other folks want to share where their opinions are as far as where we should fall here. Elizabeth.
Yeah, this is a really hard question because there is no plug and play type of option. I can't just say, oh, well, you're just going to provide the heat pump version of that furnace. That doesn't exist. So it's not something that we can size and say, no, here it is. It's a 2-pole, it's a single pole. You need this much wire. We don't even have the equipment. We're designing for something that doesn't exist. Or we're trying to prepare our homes for equipment that we can't buy today because it's not out there. So it's a really hard problem for a number of reasons. I think whatever we want to choose needs to be flexible. I do think that from a heating standpoint, it's almost certainly going to have to be 2-pole something. Definitely, a single 125 volt 20 amp breaker is not going to suffice for any sort of heat pump type of system. The electric capacity is just a really tricky thing to nail down, because again, we're guessing on equipment to replace that furnace in 20 years or whatever. And again, it doesn't exist. So we don't know if we will be able to purchase a heat pump that works better than our heat pumps today. Maybe there will be. I sure hope so, because I really want to convert my house and I don't have good options right now. But to Rob's point, if we were to size that for today, there is no heat pump out there that can heat my house without significant electric backup. And again, to size that, I have to size for my design day, which is -4 degrees. And that means I need electric resistance backup. It's going to have to, be enough to, I forget what the capacity of my furnace is, but it's a problem. I looked into it once and I would have to upgrade the whole service of my house and, split systems. Like there was no option. And like, okay, well, I'll try again in a few years and see if that will work. But so yes, we would have to then set that sizing at the equipment that we can have today if we were to do that. And we don't have great options for more single family homes. So again, I feel a little bit like Debbie Downer here because I'm in the same boat, but I don't know exactly what the answer is. We have to try to predict the future a little bit here and allow enough flexibility to try to hope that future homeowner will be in better shape than some of us are today. But this is a really tough one.
Thanks, Elizabeth. That's very helpful context as well. Adam, we'll go to you next.
Yeah, I think I just had a question for Elizabeth to follow up on what you were just saying. I'm wondering if, seeing as you're saying that there's not like the equivalent, like when we switch over to a heat pump or whatever today, that it's just like you go from the heating load capacity, but it sounds like you're talking about like you're not necessarily sure we can predict 20 years from now what the capacity or what the load will be from an equivalent heat pump. Is that kind of what you're saying? And I guess my question is are we at risk then of like oversizing or something these panels? Is that your concern about like that, or undersizing, or somewhere in between?
Yeah, like if I was to size my house, I'm sorry, forgive me all, I'm terrible, but I have a furnace and a condensing unit, right? It's a typical single family house. If I was to size my physical space in my house in a single air handler, so without having to redo all the ductwork in my house, single air handler, there is not a heat pump condenser that exists that is large enough for, and I'm standard, regular house in the boonies. It's not a little house, but it's not a huge house either. I'd say I'm very average. There's not a single heat pump condenser that exists that could meet the heating capacity without significant electric backup. And for me, that means electric resistance that can meet my loads on -4 degrees. So
Elizabeth, I feel like I have to jump in here just because we get so much disinformation about the availability of cold climate heat pumps. Maybe if, in your unique situation, when you're looking for a centralized system, that may be the case, but it's important that people here not believe that you can't find a heat pump that requires electric backup if you get below -4. We have many rated products, albeit many in the mini split category or the multi-split, that do continue to perform very well down to -14.
No, I think you're exactly right, but that's the mini split, and I'm looking for, a single condenser that can provide the full capacity for my whole house at -4, and that I can't find. But you're exactly right. If I was to design this house from scratch, I would do exactly what you just said, and how many splits, and it would be a better
this is new
design
homes
house
from scratch, so we got to keep that in mind.
Right. But this is we're not requiring that the new homes design to scratch, and unless again, and I think we're kind of hitting the nail on the head here. Do we spread that out? What do we do to try to future-proof that house, that instead of putting a single air handler, single thermostat, whatever, which is the norm, right? Do we look to have that be a little bit more distributed, or perhaps we limit the capacity to those furnaces to be within a realm where we can tap into that existing equipment, and then know how to design. But with kind of that big vagueness right now, it's a challenge, because I can't do that plug and play option. Because you're exactly right. We'd have to do some of the mini splits, and those are lower capacity heat pumps, which is great. I love that we have those options. But it doesn't.
Yep.
Yeah, exactly. That's the thing that doesn't exist, and I hope will soon.
If they do exist, I have them on my home. So
well, yeah. We're getting there, but yeah, I don't have a single one that and by single one I mean a one package condenser that could replace that, and I don't have a single air handler that could fit in and serve the amount of ductwork that I have. It's complicated, and my house is 30 years old and has 30-year-old ductwork design, and nothing about my HVAC system is great. And I don't mean to defend it in any way, but yeah, this is a challenge for how do we write a code around, that old technology and that old type of approach that would probably stay the same without some kind of interference here. I don't know that it's quite as simple as just declaring some electrical circuitry without just hoping that eventually we'll get some equipment that can do that. Like if we size, to take Rob's note and we take that 60,000 BTUs, do we just say we're going to size that electrical capacity to be the equivalent electric with a COP without electric backup? And then eventually, we've got that 3.0 COP or 4.0 COP heat pump that can indeed meet that capacity. You don't have to have the electric backup. Maybe we look at it that way, but it does mean that then we're a little bit limiting and not designing to necessarily what might be available for every capacity in every home today. And I don't know what the answer is there, but I know it's a tricky one for sure.
Thanks, Elizabeth. I'll go to Carolyn, then Adam, and then I'm just gonna quickly preview the other things that we've been thinking about for residential electric ready, and then pass it back to Kim to wrap up. How does that sound? Cool? Cool. Okay, Carolyn, go for it.
Yeah, no, I appreciated this conversation. I think, our goal is to get as close to right as we can. And I think if we're making sure that there's sufficient service capacity and panel space, even if it's not exactly right, people are already in a better place. I started thinking as I was listening to Elizabeth and Kristen's conversation, of starting to think about components of what an all-electric system is and making sure we're addressing it. And it occurred to me that one of the things we absolutely need is receptacle or junction box outdoor for the condensing unit per zone for a ducted home, right? So just trying to think about the specific components, then at least one dedicated junction box or receptacle per appliance indoor is really what would get us the closest to what we need, and still create some panel capacity for the resistance heat in doing so with the outdoor unit. So I'm just kind of offering it as more about the what we need to ultimately get to. So maybe it's a little bit more specific than the middle, but not the one on the left. Like I don't like the one on the left, but more in the middle, but that defines what some of those minimums are in terms of per appliance and the outdoor condensing unit requirements. So that's what I would advocate for.
Thanks, Carolyn. Adam, did you have thoughts or?
No, I think Carolyn kind of hit it on the head for me. I was just going to make the point too, that we kind of, along with what Kim said earlier and what Carolyn said, like we have to stay on track. We are not going to be able to predict the future, no matter how hard we try, no matter how much we look into that crystal ball, we are not going to be able to predict the future. And so we have to kind of get it as right as we can. I think that was a good way of phrasing it, Carolyn. And that's really the only point I wanted to make.
Yeah, I'm hearing some support for that middle option that kind of tries to strike the balance. Elizabeth, then Brad, and then Kristen.
Yeah, I'm just kind of continuing to brainstorm. I have a question about maybe what we are allowed to touch. Do we have the ability to maybe limit the capacity of, and I guess that I'm thinking again kind of about homes, to limit the capacity to single zones to a certain heating capacity as well? Like you have a single family home, it can't be larger. You can't have a furnace that's larger than a certain, I'd have to do the math, I don't know, 40,000 or 60,000 BTUs or whatever, where we know that there is a equipment option. And I think this is maybe a question for you guys, Kim, about what is our reach?
I think that's a good question. Let's Adam and I and David circle up on that offline, and next meeting we'll have a whole 3 hours to discuss this. So we can see if that's something within the scope of this or not.
And maybe it could be simple, you know, if you just can't have a single zone that's larger than a certain number of square feet, where we could kind of make that a good rule of thumb that fits within what we do now without having to predict the future for larger capacities. I don't know, I think that's a question, but if we've got the ability to sort of prevent people from being in the boat that I'm in, I'd love to help with that. Thanks.
No, thank you. Brad, then Kristen.
Thanks. You know, just a reminder, I think more and more we're dealing with just the compressor on the outside of the house. And for the most part, we're installing air conditioners all over the place right now. So a 240, 30 amp circuit is going to satisfy whatever a heat pump compressor is looking for at that time. So we're already doing this for air conditioners in homes. I think the only concern, I think, which could be valid because we really don't at this point have a description of what electric heat looks like, but how much electric resistance heat we allow in homes, and when maybe there's an operating temperature, what electric resistance heat, when it is triggered. But for the most part, if we're looking at like here, basalt's, you know, 125 volt, 20 amp, that certainly wouldn't meet the requirements of a compressor that would provide heating and air conditioning. You wouldn't use that to install an air conditioner outside of a house. So I think we certainly could consider a 240 volt, 30 amp circuit on the outside of the house where the compressor would be, as meeting the requirements for electrical wiring.
And I just want to add, and we didn't get to this slide today, and I don't know we will because we're running out of time, but Brad, that is an exception we did see in the code language, is where people are putting in the wiring for air conditioning units. It exempts you from the electric readiness for space heating, knowing that that electric capacity is there already.
Just one thing, the electrical capacity is not there already, just for the outdoor condenser unit. If you go all electric, you still require the capacity for the backup resistance. So that's where I mentioned, if you think about the furnace as an indoor location, you may still need that additional service capacity.
Thanks, Carolyn. Kristen, you want to wrap up?
Yeah, just thinking of homes as a system, really appreciate everyone's comments here. Upon further reflection, I do think there is a strong case to be made between some kind of blend between specific and more general. For example, there are certain appliances that are less likely to be installed in an alternate location. So your water heater has got the plumbing lines there. It's likely you're going to need an outlet next to a water heater to be able to convert. Likewise, you know, perhaps with certain kitchen appliances or your laundry, it'd be really nice to have those plugs available there, the receptacles. And then from the home as a system standpoint, the codes have much more stringent requirements around air change rates. So what you don't want is to have adequate electrical panel capacity, but then you have trades come in to install your circuit and they mess up your air barrier. And then your home's not performing like it was supposed to in the beginning. So from that standpoint, holistically, I'd argue for us trying to identify where we do think it is more appropriate to have a receptacle installed. The one reason that I would be hesitant to extend that to HVAC is for some of the concerns that people have highlighted here. It may be the case that you may have to go from a centralized unit to a more distributed, say, mini split or multi-split in the future, that, you know, having a 220 installed next to your existing gas furnace may not help. Now there may be new and expanded options in the future, but I do think some flexibility there would be nice. And then also recognizing that most homes in Colorado these days are installed with air conditioners. Maybe a way forward would be to take the very conservative, you know, electric to BTU conversion that I think Rob put forth earlier, and then subtract from that any capacity that's already installed for AC to kind of give a credit or a boost for that AC capacity, because we are probably talking about heat pumps for a heating electrification scenario, and that there should be some acknowledgement for that. Thanks.
Thanks, Kristen. That's really helpful. And I just wanted to note really quickly that she kind of got to that last point in the definition of electric ready, which is the adequate physical space, which we haven't really touched on yet. So just a preview of our conversation next week that we will continue. So with that, I'll pass it back to Kim to wrap up the meeting.
Thanks, Allie. And yeah, Ron.
Just a quick thought that just crossed my mind is we've been talking a lot about the electrical infrastructure to convert to heat pump technology, but there's also other line sets and such that would require penetration.
Condensate.
So, yeah, condensate and the refrigerant lines. So maybe there's some other pieces of this that we might need to think about too.
Thanks, Ron, for flagging those. And we have seen condensate mentioned in existing code language. I've not yet come across any code language that specifically speaks to refrigerant lines, but definitely something we can consider. So, yeah, thank you all for the discussion. This is not an easy one, as you all alluded to. And I think next time I don't know if we have folks on the call who have implemented an electric ready code, but it might be helpful a starting point to hear from some folks who've already written code language like this as to why it was written the way that it was written and what types of considerations went into the code language as it was written. And I also want to flag that our team has a call with the city of Denver on later this week to discuss electric ready, specifically in the large commercial context, but we can also try to get some insights from their team as to, why they chose the middle ground language they did. So I think with that, we'll just leave it there. Next week it'll be, next Thursday, we're going to reconvene February 23rd to continue our discussion on electric ready for residential, small commercial, and then we'll hope to dive into large commercial as well. And I don't believe we'll have any follow-up between now and then for you guys, but if we get any research or resources or learn anything from any communities, we'll forward any resources along to you guys between now and then. And then I would just ask as a general reminder that you guys be reviewing the electric ready code language that's been shared with the board a couple times in advance of next week's meeting so that you guys have the example codes in front of you and can speak to the things you like and dislike and what other things we might need to be considering. So lots to talk about as always, but I just want to say again, thank you guys for your time and your attention and your robust discussion today. Appreciate all of you, and I hope you guys have a great rest of your week.